During Consoleatte's stay, Fulcanelli would only appear to him on rare occasions, and all conversation, if any, was brief, after which he seemed to disappear for weeks on end. But in each encounter, he noticed that the master continued to grow younger, progressively de-aging, slowly but surely. And more bizarrely, Consoleatte described his features as appearing more feminine over time. One morning, Consoleatte woke up early and, craving a breath of fresh air, he went out to the courtyard with his shirt still unbuttoned and his braces hanging loose from his trousers. As he leaned against an archway, enjoying the quiet morning air, he spied three women enter the courtyard in long flowing dresses, and as they passed by him, suddenly one woman stopped and turned toward him and greeted him. Consoleatte's jaw dropped, completely speechless. The woman was Fulcanelli, and he wasn't just cross-dressing, it was a full-on physical transformation. While Consoleatte is vague with the details, it seems that Fulcanelli still possessed some male features, but was clearly androgynous and leaning toward female. While this transformation might sound absolutely bizarre out of context, this is actually one of the most important motifs in alchemical literature, that of the hermaphrodite, usually depicted as a two-headed being bearing physical features of both sexes. The specific name for this symbol is the divine androgyne. In Hermetic alchemy, the divine androgyne represents the sacred union between masculine and feminine, day and night, spirit and matter. A dualism between two opposing forces where unification represents a transcendental perfection. Some alchemists related this sacred union to the chemical marriage between substances, required in the laboratory production of the philosopher's stone. However, others interpreted the divine androgyne as a step beyond the stone, and even beyond the elixir of life. And just as those substances were often spoken of literally, so too was the divine androgyne as a physical transformation. And it was a rather graphic process, which might explain why Fulcanelli spent great periods of time locked away in his castle quarters. As described by the historian Laurenite Jajic, quote, "Some of the more obscure alchemical literature does point to this androgyny. The adept going through the transformation supposedly loses all hair, teeth, and nails, and grows new ones. The skin becomes younger, smoother, and the face takes on asexual characteristics." End quote. Artwork of the divine androgyne is often accompanied by the Latin word rebus, which translates to dual or double matter. Rebus was said to be the ultimate end product of the magnum opus, and thus Fulcanelli's transformation into this androgynous hermaphroditic form was the direct result of one thing: his completion of the masterwork of alchemy. According to Consoleatte's account, the divine androgyne spoke only a single sentence to him, but one of immense gravity. Quote, "The time will come, my son, when you will no longer be able to work in alchemy, when it will be necessary for you to search for the rare and blessed land along the frontiers to the south." End quote. Indeed, Consoleatte would heed this advice given to him by the divine androgyne. Not long after this, he abandoned his alchemical work and departed from the compound, for reasons he can't fully remember. After he left, Consoleatte claimed that all his memories of the events had become dreamlike, vague, and increasingly hard to recall, as if he felt some sort of hypnosis had been used on him to make him forget. Alternatively, a friend of his theorized that he'd been, quote, "in another dimension, a point where such meetings are possible," end quote. While we can't say where Consoleatte actually was, nor can his bizarre account of this young feminine Fulcanelli be proven, there is some small amount of evidence to at least back up the truth of his journey. This comes from the respected scientific historian Gerard Heim, the founder of the Society of the Study of Alchemy and Early Chemistry, and the editor of his journal, Ambix. So certainly he's a trustworthy source. In the late 1950s, Heim befriended Consoleatte's daughter, and on one occasion, she'd brought over some of her father's belongings to show him, including his passport. Heim had always doubted Consoleette's story, so he flipped through the passport carefully, looking for evidence that he was in Spain in 1954. To Heim's surprise, not only did the passport stamps show that Consoleette indeed traveled to Seville in 1954, but that Consoleette stayed in Spain for several months as he described. Over the years, many have tried to dig up hotel records of Consoleette staying in Seville, or anyone who may have met with him, but nothing has ever been found. No one knows exactly where Consoleette went or what he did, only that Consoleette's account has never been debunked. That being said, Consoleette was not the only person to report seeing Fulcanelli after his disappearance. In fact, the first witness testimony predated his by 17 years, and it was taken so seriously that it spurred a widespread search for the master by American intelligence officials. It was a late evening at the laboratories of the Gas Board of Paris in June 1937. Here, scientific tests were being directed by Dr. André Elbrenner, a visionary scientist who, at the time, was pioneering the field of nuclear physics. His main assistant was Jacques Bergier, a chemical engineer. At this point, it's worth mentioning that Bergier was a multi-talented man. More than just a highly educated scientist, he'd go on to become a French resistance secret agent, a respected journalist, and eventually one of the most famous occult researchers to ever live, no doubt inspired by the fateful meetings soon to occur. He was also blessed with an eidetic or photographic memory, which makes his claim believable that he recorded the words this mysterious figure spoke to him verbatim. Bergier's boss, Dr. André Elbrenner, was well known for his expertise, so distinguished individuals would frequently contact him to offer ideas, insights, remarks, and questions. However, Elbrenner was an introverted, heavily introspected man, so wrapped up in his own thoughts that he'd often wear mismatched clothing. Suffice it to say, he wasn't very good at paying attention in conversations. So, after learning of his assistant's gift of photographic memory, Elbrenner was overjoyed and tasked Jacques Bergier to meet with every single guest in his stead. This particular guest, however, specially requested a meeting late in the evening, so Bergier sat alone in a chair, notebook in hand, awaiting their arrival at the laboratory. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat as he realized a man was standing at the dark end of the room. Before Bergier could say a word, the figure stepped out from the shadows and spoke to him, quote, "Monsieur André Elbrenner, whose assistant I believe you are, is carrying out research on nuclear energy. Monsieur Elbrenner has been good enough to keep me informed as to the results of some of his experiments." End quote. Dr. Elbrenner had previously pioneered a wide variety of scientific achievements, from artificial leather and liquid sterilization to hydraulic elevators and electric batteries. But 3 years before this meeting, Elbrenner had turned his attention entirely toward nuclear physics, and specifically the power potential of nuclear reactions. And not long after this meeting, both Elbrenner and Bergier would submit a report to the French Academy of Sciences detailing the development of the nuclear weapon known as a hydrogen bomb. To many, this rapid advancement in a field so new at the time adds believability to Jacques Bergier's claim that it was this visitor who gave the information necessary for Elbrenner to make this breakthrough, and Bergier would explicitly identify him as the alchemist Fulcanelli. The following was spoken verbatim by Fulcanelli to Bergier, quote, "You're on the brink of success, as indeed are several other of our scientists today. Please allow me. Be very, very careful. I warn you, the work that you and your contemporaries are undertaking is appallingly dangerous. It imperils not only you personally, it is a threat to the whole of humanity. The liberation of nuclear power is easier than you think, and the radioactivity artificially produced can poison the atmosphere of our planet in a very short time, a few years. Moreover, atomic explosives can be produced from a few grains of metal, powerful enough to destroy whole cities. I'm telling you this for a fact. The alchemists have known it for a very long time. End quote. If Bergier is to be believed, these words from Fulcanelli predated the start of the Manhattan Project, the United States secret development of the first atomic bomb, by half a decade. The vast majority of the world had never even heard of the concept of a nuclear weapon. But Fulcanelli's warning was not over just yet. He proceeded to recount a lost history of ancient civilizations whose annihilation was self-inflicted, and are doomed to repeat the same mistake. Quote, "There have been civilizations in the past that were familiar with atomic energy, and that by misusing it, they were totally destroyed. But certain techniques have partially survived. I would also ask you to remember that the alchemists' researches were colored by moral and religious preoccupations, whereas modern physics was created as science without a conscience. I have thought it my duty to warn a few research workers here and there, but have no hope of seeing this warning prove effective." End quote. While Fulcanelli described a history we've never been taught, there are in fact theories that nuclear war occurred in the ancient past, particularly in India, where excavations of certain ancient sites have revealed, among other things, flattened and highly radioactive skeletons, layers of radioactive ash, and massive craters without any trace of the ground having been hit by a meteor. The sacred Sanskrit scripture, the Mahabharata, also contains some extremely suspicious descriptions of, quote, "a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as the 1,000 suns, billowing smoke clouds rising after its first explosion, formed into expanding round circles. The dead were reduced to ashes. The survivors' hair and nails fell out. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected." End quote. I actually have an entire video planned on this topic, by the way, but I'm not sure when it's going to come out, so make sure to ding the notifications bell so you don't miss my deep dive into the mystery of ancient nuclear war. But the real mystery here is what effect Fulcanelli's warning may have had on the future development of atomic weapons. What we do know for sure is that in the spring of 1940, 3 years later, both Dr. Elbrenner and Bergier had mapped out the construction of a thermonuclear bomb, also known as a hydrogen bomb. That same year, Nazi Germany invaded France, and in 1943, Elbrenner was arrested by the Nazi Gestapo, and the same would happen to Bergier soon after. While Bergier was able to survive his time in concentration camp, Elbrenner was not so lucky. As such an accomplished scientist, the Nazis interrogated him relentlessly, and at one point they locked him away for months in a tiny windowless room infested with bed bugs. Eventually the bites from the bugs became infected, which led to pneumonia, which Elbrenner would die from. In modern day, Elbrenner is remembered as a hero for his efforts to educate his fellow prisoners in nutrition and having never given up a sliver of information to his captors in the face of torture and certain death. As I mentioned though, his former assistant Jacques Bergier would not only survive, but in 1945, Bergier escaped his concentration camp and went on to join the French resistance as a secret agent and spy. According to his account, that July, he'd broken into the lakeside home of a German corporate magnate who'd been conducting significant business with the Nazi Party, and inside this home, he discovered a safe. Bergier cracked it open, and in it was nothing else but a small bottle containing an extremely heavy powder. Its label read, quote, "uranium for atomic applications," end quote. This was the first tangible proof that Germany was constructing an atomic weapon. Immediately, Bergier reported his findings to the Allied authorities, the Americans, but they acted extremely skeptical and largely ignored his worries, saying such a thing was impossible. However, this was an act, a complete ruse to cover up the United States' own top-secret atomic program, codenamed the Manhattan Project. 1 month later, in August 1945, the first nuclear weapon used in warfare was dropped by the United States on Hiroshima, Japan, to such destructive effect that, even to this day, it's difficult for any normal person to truly gauge the sheer horror of this event and its lasting repercussions. It was only after the bomb had detonated and their secret was revealed to the world that the Americans recontacted Jacques Bergier in an attempt to retrieve the bottle of uranium and question him fully. Knowing that they hadn't been straight with him, they made various offers, and eventually one struck Bergier enough that he agreed. This was the then unpublished proof of the report on the military uses of atomic energy, authored by the American nuclear physicist Henry DeWolf Smythe. This report detailed exactly how the power of an atom could be unleashed and controlled. Left alone to read it, Bergier's heart sunk. The exact words Fulcanelli said to him in 1937 were, quote, "I shall not attempt to prove to you what I'm now going to say, but I ask you to repeat it to Monsieur Elberner. Certain geometrical arrangements of highly purified materials are enough to release atomic forces without having recourse to either electricity or vacuum techniques." End quote. These words of the master alchemist paralleled the report's description of an early nuclear reactor known as the atomic pile, first built in 1942. Just as Fulcanelli had stated, the atomic pile relied on the precise geometrical arrangements of extremely pure substances, specifically uranium and graphite, something which Fulcanelli, let alone anyone else in the world, should have never known 5 years prior. In shock, Jacques Bergier gave the Americans a full testimony of his meeting with Fulcanelli, and as a direct result, the Office for Strategic Services, the forerunner of the American CIA, initiated an immediate, extensive search for the alchemist. They stated that apprehending him was essential for the safety of the world and the Allied cause, and that it was truly disturbing that some unknown person had knowledge of nuclear weapons in 1937. However, perhaps even more disturbing was a hidden reality reported by the journalist Louis Poels. Quote, "Leading up to the bombing of Hiroshima, the Americans were paying fabulous prices for any manuscripts or documents dealing with alchemy." End quote. Moreover, the American Office for Strategic Services may have already had Fulcanelli on their wanted list long before Bergier gave his testimony. After these events, the researcher Kenneth Rayner Johnson interviewed the modern alchemist Frater Albertus, who'd been a close contact of Fulcanelli's surviving student, Eugène Consoliet. As Johnson recounts in his book, The Fulcanelli Phenomenon, quote, "Frater Albertus says that the reason the Office for Strategic Services launched a search for Fulcanelli and are still seeking him is not simply because of his advanced knowledge of alchemy, but because he is rumored to possess a manuscript by Roger Bacon giving the formulae for nuclear fission and fusion. Bacon, says Albertus, made a reference in his writings to a certain material from which an explosive can be made that can destroy an entire army or city with a blinding flash." End quote. While others have claimed to have met Fulcanelli, none compare in the depth and historical possibility of the two encounters experienced by Eugène Consoliet and Jacques Bergier. So if Fulcanelli was alive as late as 1954, the date given in Consoliet's account, the question is simple. Might Fulcanelli still be alive to this day? Well, as close as we can get, maybe the year 1978. The occult scholar and historian David Oveson related details of a meeting he had in Florence, Italy in 1978 with an elderly man he refers to as a master alchemist. Oveson recalls that during the course of the conversation, this master suddenly asked him if he knew Fulcanelli. Surprised by the question, Oveson simply said that he assumed Fulcanelli was long dead. The elderly master then cracked a smile and responded, quote, "Oh, I do not think that is the case at all. Fulcanelli is alive. Fulcanelli is even older than me, yet he is still alive. He lives here in Florence. I have met him. I meet him from time to time. Fulcanelli is far wiser than most of his readers know. One day some scholar will claim that they have finally discovered who Fulcanelli was, but that scholar will be wrong." End quote. In the history, literature, and lore of alchemy, secrecy is a very apparent theme. For example, Chinese alchemists would repeat this maxim from ancient times, quote, "Beware, do not allow even an insect to be in the room where you are working," end quote. It was more than simply guarding trade secrets. Alchemists would labor to keep their knowledge hidden, believing that the potential power of their art was so great that it must only be accessed by true adepts. The use of dense symbolism and allegory was just the baseline. Alchemists were among the first pioneers of cryptography, encrypting their texts with sophisticated ciphers and even completely invented languages, some of which remain uncracked to this day, such as the famous Voynich manuscript. Fulcanelli's own name is an example of deliberate encryption. The most agreed upon theory is that it's a play on words, and specifically a reference to Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, with Fulcanelli meaning little Vulcan. There's significant meaning embedded in this. Vulcan is the Roman god of fire, the creative fire of metalworking, as well as the destructive fire of volcanoes. In fact, Vulcan is where the word volcano comes from. And it's not hard to see the ties between volcanoes and metalworking, as metallurgy requires a furnace, an enclosed, superheated chamber which we can easily liken to a little volcano. Thus, the name Little Vulcan paints an image so essential to alchemists. That of the fiery laboratory furnace, the place where the brand new alchemist first discovers the transformative properties of metal, and where the eventual master will someday observe the first sign of the magnum opus. As stated by the occult scholar David Oveson, quote, "The alchemist insisted that one must pass one's thinking through the furnace many times." End quote. We might recall that Consoliet mentioned that Fulcanelli's pocketbook had been browned as a result of him laboring for years, day after day, at the massive furnace in his personal laboratory. Thus, Fulcanelli's name seems to have encoded something of immense significance to him, and a perfect example of how alchemical secrets may be hidden and revealed. But on the topic of names, it's worth pondering why countless alchemical manuscripts have been attributed to legendary or historical figures, or even completely fictional pseudonyms like Fulcanelli, despite the extensive labor these alchemists took in order to research and compile such vast swaths of information. Some of these works are so impressive, they imply not only the author's sheer brilliance, but the sum of their entire life's work. This tradition, known as pseudepigraphy, was practiced so widely that we might even say it was part of the alchemist's creed. Like countless other famous alchemists, Fulcanelli never once revealed his true identity. However, his student Eugène Consoliet did reveal some odd details of Fulcanelli's reasoning for this. Quote, "The master expressed his absolute and unshakable resolve to keep his real identity in the background. He judged it necessary to keep the anonymity, which he had always observed, more perhaps from natural inclination than from strict regard for the rule of secrecy." End quote. That's a bit interesting if you think about it. Consoliet admitted that Fulcanelli hid his identity for personal reasons, as opposed to alchemic tradition. While it's possible that he could have just been introverted, might there be more to the picture? What if there was a reason Fulcanelli didn't, or couldn't, reveal who he was? It's possible that Fulcanelli is someone we've already met. In fact, fingers seem to point toward two suspects in particular. While we know Fulcanelli published 2 books, a third book, titled End of the World's Glory, is said to exist, and its handwritten pages were left with his most devoted student, Eugène Consoliet, who decided that it should remain unpublished. That's a bit suspicious, for sure. Thus, it's no surprise that Consoliet is the first person most suspect to be the man behind the curtain, the master alchemist's true identity, especially when the vast majority of information we know of Fulcanelli came directly from Consoliet. As for the motive, many argue that Consoliet had originally set out to follow the ways of the great alchemists before him, abiding by the ancient creed of pseudepigraphy. Over time, however, he came to recognize the influence and power of his fictional master's reputation and thus turned toward using it to increase his own status and prestige, and maximize the allure of his teachings. If this was the reality, clearly this strategy worked. That said, the Consoliet theory is easy to debunk. Looking at the 2 books published by Fulcanelli, one thing becomes incredibly clear. Whoever Fulcanelli was, he was an extremely educated man. His writings draw from multiple fields of study and demonstrate proficiencies in an extensive range of disciplines. And not only is the content of the 2 books evidence of this, but the content itself is encoded with multiple layers of wordplay, replete with Greek and Latin puns that show a fluency in both languages, metaphors that draw from obscure esoteric lore, and subtle references to ancient alchemical symbols and beliefs. Clearly, this person was not only gifted in their intelligence and creativity, but had lived long enough on this earth to expose themselves to such an amount of information, let alone absorb and understand it. When the first book was written, Consoliet would have been in his early to mid-20s. Simply put, this man was far too young to have authored or even imitated a work of such wide-ranging scholarship. Moreover, there's a clear difference in the writing style of the introductions written by Consoliet compared to the rest of the book's contents. As Jacques Sadoul, the author of Alchemists and Gold, states, quote, "As regards the proof, there can be no doubt whatsoever that the writings do not come from the same pen." End quote. So, while he's often accused prematurely, most scholars agree that Eugène Consoliet is off the list. However, this brings us to his older companion, Julien Champagne. If you Google the name Fulcanelli, you'll quickly be met by the image of a man with spectacles, hound dog eyes, and a drooping French bohemian-style mustache. This portrait is so commonly associated with the name Fulcanelli that it might easily come off as a painting of the great master himself. And according to some sources, this might not be far from the truth. As I've shown it earlier in this video, you might already know this is a painting of Julien Champagne, the talented but perpetually poverty-stricken artist and the mentor of Eugène Consoliet. But the reason why many consider it a picture of Fulcanelli is due to the testimony of the Egyptologist and mystic Are Chouala de Lubitsch. Chouala is one of the few to seriously claim to have met Fulcanelli in person, as he recounted, quote, "I came in touch with the man quite naturally, as we were frequenting the same cafe. This was before the First World War. I never took a liking to Fulcanelli, but he was the only one in Paris I could talk to about the alchemical work. He had a few disciples of sorts, Eugène Consoliet, of course, who never left his side. He was a very strange fellow, a prankster, and he lived the Fulcanelli intrigue in all its details." End quote. Chouala went on to claim that during one of their meetings, the alchemist allowed the Egyptologist to make a sketch of him. Admittedly, this seems both unlikely and quite out of character for Fulcanelli. But stick around because Schwalla's story gets even stranger. As you may have guessed, his sketch shows a striking resemblance to the appearance of one Julien Champagne. But the thing is, Schwalla never met Champagne. He only met and knew a man who called himself Fulcanelli. Schwalla also claimed that Fulcanelli died in 1932, which happens to be the same year as Champagne. But where did he get this information? Well, apparently it was firsthand. Schwalla witnessed the alchemist on his deathbed, and it was a gruesome scene. Quote, Fulcanelli was already sick when he came here last time, limping somewhat and complaining of circulatory problems. 6 weeks later, he wrote me a line announcing a meeting. When I arrived, he was turning black and he could barely speak. He was dead the next morning. End quote. According to Schwalla, the cause of Fulcanelli's fatal condition and the distinct blackening of his skin was his so-called master's countless failed experiments. Specifically, it was his attempts to transmute lead into gold. Interestingly, not only does Schwalla assert that Fulcanelli was a false master and failed alchemist, but that he was a plagiarizer as well. According to Schwalla, quote, I had been working on a book with detailed proof through the structural elements of the cathedrals that they were a Christian expression of the Hermetic alchemical work. When I showed Fulcanelli the manuscript, he asked to borrow it for a few days. It took me a long time to get the manuscript back, and when he did return it, his opinion was that it revealed too much, and the publication was bound to lead me to adverse consequences. Then, in 1926, I find out about the publication of The Mystery of the Cathedrals. It was completely based on my work. End quote. As odd and inflammatory as R.A. Schwalla's account was, he wasn't the only person to draw a connection between Champagne and Fulcanelli. The other was the original publisher of Fulcanelli's books, a man named Jean Schmidt. In his testimony, Schmidt claimed that 1 month before Eugène Consoliet approached him with the manuscript, he'd met another man with a striking mustache who didn't give his name despite entering a long conversation with the publisher. What was so striking to him was how passionate this man was about two specific things: alchemical architecture and various forms of coded language. A month later, when Consoliet provided Schmidt with Fulcanelli's first manuscript for printing, he stated that the author, Fulcanelli, wished to remain anonymous. This, of course, piqued Schmidt's curiosity, so as soon as Consoliet left, Schmidt flipped through the manuscript's pages. According to his account, quote, I perused the manuscript to find that it bore the same speech patterns of the words of my mysterious earlier visitor. The cryptic language, the slang, the relationship of Gothic architecture to Hermetic alchemy, end quote. When Consoliet returned to the publisher, this time he was accompanied by Champagne, who'd come to sign the drawings he'd made for the book. Though it was hard for the publisher to recognize a man he may or may not have seen a month ago, an odd detail confirmed his suspicion. Schmidt stated, quote, although the illustrator appeared to be treated as a collaborator without any literary responsibility, I was surprised to note that in my presence, Monsieur Consoliet showed him extraordinary respect and admiration, addressing him 1 minute as master, the next my master, when simply talking to him. End quote. This wholly convinced Schmidt that Fulcanelli and Champagne were one and the same. So with Champagne under the microscope, let's take a closer look at who exactly this Frenchman was. Julien Champagne was a rather eccentric individual. He'd eat only 1 meal a day and sleep fully clothed in his daily attire. He also had a unique hatred of electric lighting, but loved to stay up late at night, so he'd wade his way through the darkness using a paraffin lamp with a magnifying glass attached to it, which projected the beam outward like a miniature lighthouse. Champagne also had a reputation as a practical joker with a wry sense of humor. For example, one of his hobbies while attending the School of the Fine Arts was forging fake illuminated manuscripts and getting his fellow students and even teachers to believe they were real. He'd use ink mixed with a small amount of acid to slightly damage the paper and make his creations appear far older than they were. He was an expert calligrapher, even as a student. And according to his sister, he'd been practicing alchemy seriously since he was a young teen, and by adulthood, he was well read in a vast amount of esoteric literature. Champagne was clearly gifted in his intelligence and abilities, and for the most part, he appears to closely fit the Fulcanelli profile. Moreover, some researchers compared handwriting samples taken from Champagne and Fulcanelli and argue that they bear a noticeable resemblance to one another, though they're not a perfect match. Bigger issues with this theory emerge when we consider Champagne's personality. Compared to Fulcanelli, who was remarkably subtle in how he expressed himself in his writings, Champagne was a rather extravagant and colorful individual. He boasted a huge mustache and was known to make funny faces at people, and was overly paranoid of left-handed occultism, that is, the dark path of magic, something which he frequently warned his friends about. And where Fulcanelli's work reflects an author with great restraint and discipline, something required of a master alchemist, Champagne was the opposite. He was terrible with money and lived in lifelong poverty. He also spent most of his adulthood as a chain smoker and a huge fan of Pernod, the original brand of absinthe. On drunken nights, he was known to boast, brag, and speak faster than he could think. And in the last decade of his life, he lost complete control. As I mentioned before, his toes literally fell off due to the gangrene in his legs, brought on by pounding down bottle after bottle of absinthe. This eventually confined him to his 6th floor attic apartment, and ultimately, it killed him. So while Champagne may sound like an interesting character, it's actually his character itself that's led many researchers to exclude him as a suspect. Champagne's extravagant energy and lack of restraint and discipline don't quite align with an individual capable of producing what thousands consider to be back-to-back alchemical masterworks. Consoliet also dismissed the Champagne theory as complete nonsense, though if the two were in cahoots, that's exactly what we'd expect. I'd say Julien Champagne is a strong suspect, but there's still one more theory left on the table, and that's the possibility that Fulcanelli could have been real. Eugène Consoliet died of age-related complications on April 17, 1982, and up to his last breath, Consoliet continued to maintain that Fulcanelli was neither he nor Champagne. He insisted that Fulcanelli was Fulcanelli, a true-to-life master of alchemy, one who discovered the secret, one who achieved immortality, and one who evolved quite literally into the divine androgyne. Consoliet also revealed his personal theory on who Fulcanelli's teacher, the original master, may have been. Quote, "Anyone with knowledge of the alchemical books of the past will accept as a basic premise that oral instruction from master to pupil is the most valuable of all. Fulcanelli received his own initiation in this way. Basil Valentin was my master's initiator." End quote. This Basil Valentin was a German alchemist of the 15th century, renowned for his considerable knowledge of chemistry, which modern chemists acknowledge was decades, if not centuries ahead of his time. Interestingly though, even though Basil Valentin's writings are both impressive and very real, there's no evidence of Valentin himself existing. His name doesn't appear on any official record, and even his portraits are confirmed to be fabricated. Moreover, while Valentin is said to have been born in 1394, his earliest publication dates to the year 1602, over 200 years later. But the information it contained was indisputably written by a true master of alchemy. It's no wonder why many speculate that Valentin achieved the magnum opus and lived long enough to train the last alchemist, Fulcanelli. But seeing as how both shared a preference for complete anonymity, perhaps they were one and the same. With immortal alchemists, you never really know. All we have are stories and theories, and legends of an elixir that transcends possibility. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this investigation and haven't seen my video, The Life and Times of an Immortal Alchemist, we explore the mystery of the very real and very eccentric Count of Saint Germain. And if you love alchemy and want more, please give this video a like and let me know in the comments what immortal alchemist I should cover next. Finally, I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons because your support is my elixir. I'm Mr. Mythos. This video is sponsored by Established Titles. Have you seen this man? He might call himself Comte de Saint-Germain or the Count of Saint-Germain in English. Other names he used included Marquis de Montferrat, Chevalier Schuning, Count Weldon, and Prince Rákóczi, the son of Francis Rákóczi II of Transylvania. He was all of these people, and perhaps none, because the Count of Saint-Germain never once revealed his true identity. The Count was one of the most well-connected people across all of 18th century Europe. He was the best friend of the French king Louis XV, and also that of Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, which makes up a large part of modern-day Germany. He brokered peace deals between nations, all while making the famous playboy Giacomo Casanova, who many of his day called the world's greatest lover, seethe with envy of the Count's ways with women. Outside the bedroom, though, as the Count claimed to be a celibate. Might I mention that all of these people confirmed his ability to speak nearly a dozen languages, including Chinese, many without accent, his seemingly photographic knowledge of every major historical event in Europe for the past 1,000 years, and his vast accomplishments as a master violinist, composer, swordsman, painter, philosopher, and alchemist. That last one is particularly important, as you will soon see. I should also mention that he was laughably wealthy and gave away real diamonds and other precious jewels as gifts to the people he met. I'm not just making things up here, there's significant documentation on all of this, which we will be going into in detail. But the kicker is that the Count of Saint-Germain claimed to be over 300 years old, and his death remains debated to this day. This is the tale of probably the most believable case of a real-life immortal, if you're willing to consider it. Hey fellow seekers, welcome. I'm Mr. Mythos. If you're a fan of strange and ancient mysteries with research so deep you're guaranteed to fall down the rabbit hole, you're in the right place. I humbly ask that you give this video a like and ding the notifications bell so you don't miss any of the rare info we'll be digging into every video. And if you love it, please share it with a friend. But before we get into the Count, if you think my name is actually Mr. Mythos, unfortunately that's not true. It's actually Lord Mythos, according to this certificate from today's sponsor, Established Titles. We'll definitely be exploring his love for jewels later on, as is actually a key piece of this mystery. The Count also always presented himself in French as the Comte de Saint-Germain, while also admitting that he wasn't French. And speaking of how he presented himself, the Count was not one for formality, and spoke as frank, uncouth, and madly as he felt, always with the utmost confidence. His strong personality would command every room he entered. Reportedly, the Italian adventurer and playboy Giacomo Casanova would get annoyed with him at the dinner table, simply because the Count talked endlessly with his seemingly bottomless barrel of stories that entertained high royalty and lovely ladies alike. The Count of Saint-Germain was well conscious of his superiority. In his memoirs, the French politician and royal Charles Henry Baron de Gleichen described his first time meeting him at a dinner party. Quote, "He threw down his hat and sword, sat down in an armchair near the fire, and interrupted the conversation by saying to the man who was speaking, 'You do not know what you are saying. I am the only person who is competent to speak on this subject, and I have exhausted it.' It was the same with music, which I gave up when I found I had no more to learn. End quote. Though the Count was obviously educated and trained, his utter mastery of multiple fields proved inexplicable. Horace Walpole even wrote, quote, "He was too great a musician not to have been famous if he had not been a gentleman." End quote. So, obviously, he was a gifted musician, but he was also a master painter. Baron de Glyken's memoirs recalled a day when the Count invited him to his house. Quote, "The paintings he showed me all bore a stamp of singularity or perfection, which made them more interesting than many works of art of the highest order." End quote. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, none of the paintings made by the Count of Saint Germain have survived or been identified in modern day. But this account from Baron de Glyken was just one of many to reference his striking talent as an artist. Regarding the Count's ability as a polyglot, a speaker of multiple languages, Horace Walpole did provide an interesting detail that may hint at his true background. According to Walpole, quote, "He spoke Italian and French with the greatest facility, though it was evident that neither was his language. He understood Polish and soon learned to understand English and talk it a little, but Spanish or Portuguese seemed to be his natural language." End quote. Interestingly, in all of his eventful appearances and influential actions in Europe, not a single one occurred in Spain or Portugal. So it does make you wonder, if he had been born in one of these countries, why he might have left and never returned. After the Count of Saint Germain was released by London authorities in 1745, he quickly gathered his things, severed ties with those he met, and left the British Isles. From here, he vanished without a trace for more than 14 years. This wouldn't be the last time the Count demonstrated his ability to completely disappear, but it was the one that led him to the turning point of his career, and the beginning of his dominating and perplexing reputation across Europe. In 1758, the Count of Saint Germain showed up suddenly and inexplicably in France, specifically in his then capital city of Versailles, the home of the French royal family. As an alchemist, he claimed to have recipes for rare and precious dyes, which landed him in the presence of Madame de Pompadour, the chief mistress of the French king, Louis XV. Casanova recounts, quote, "He had contrived to gain the favor of Madame de Pompadour, who had spoken about him to the king. The king had given him a suite of rooms at Chambord and 100,000 francs for the construction of a laboratory." End quote. This makes the Count's mastery of alchemy undeniable, as it was this skill specifically that landed him private quarters in the Chateau de Chambord, a massive and ornate palace owned by the French king. Yes, this man who hadn't been heard of for over a decade simply showed up in France, talked his way up to the queen, and won himself a free apartment in the king's palace. This is indisputable history. Just 1 year later, in 1749, he would become an official member of Louis XV's royal court, as a personal diplomat of the king. In fact, they were so close that if anybody in the Count's life ever came to know his true identity, it probably would have been Louis XV. Many people consider them to be best friends. For entire evenings, the king would shut himself in a room with his chief mistress, Madame de Pompadour, and the Count of Saint Germain, indulging in the conversations they had and treating the Count with absolute respect for his range of knowledge. This close friendship obviously spurred jealousy in Louis's court, and ultimately, it turned the Count into a well-known celebrity across all of Europe. It was also when Giacomo Casanova first met the man who would become his perfect rival. If you don't know who Casanova is, he was an accomplished Italian adventurer who became remarkably famous for his elaborate affairs with women. He claimed to have slept with at least 136 women, though historians believe that number may have been hundreds higher. Reflecting on his sexual conquests, Casanova wrote, quote, "I never found any occupation more important. Feeling that I was born for the sex opposite of mine, I have always loved it and done all that I could to make myself loved by it." End quote. Casanova's reputation was so profound and enduring that today his name can be found in the Merriam-Webster dictionary an informal noun with the definition a man known for seducing women and having many lovers. You may think no man could ever rival Casanova, but the Count of Saint Germain would. After his very first meeting with the Count at a dinner party, Casanova was utterly baffled and wrote, quote, "This individual, instead of eating, talked from the beginning of the meal to the end. It may safely be said that as a conversationalist, he was unequaled. He was a scholar, linguist, musician, and chemist, good-looking and a perfect ladies' man." End quote. Casanova would also introduce one of the most important details of the story. Quote, "This extraordinary man would say in an easy, assured manner that he was 300 years old, that he knew the secret of the universal medicine, that he possessed a mastery over nature. All this, he said, was a mere trifle to him." End quote. To this day, there are easily tens of thousands of people and entire religions that believe the Count of Saint Germain was a genuine immortal being. We'll get into those religious beliefs, such as those held by Theosophy, near the end, but there are legitimate reasons why this belief is so widely maintained. The handsome, youthful look of the Count, noticed by Casanova, would also be noted by almost everyone he met. They described him as looking around 40 years old. But the thing is, as the years passed, the Count didn't seem to get any older. And decades later, several of these people would report seeing the same man, unaffected by age. Most of these reports come after his alleged death, though his death itself is seriously questionable. What's important to note, though, is that during his time in France, the Count of Saint Germain was known to keep a mysterious vial of liquid with him, tucked under his coat. When he was asked about it, he not so subtly suggested that it was a magical potion he had concocted himself, and that it was somehow connected to his youthful appearance. Remember, he told Casanova that he was at least 300 years old. Casanova would also write that, quote, "He flattered women not that he would make them young again, which he modestly confessed was beyond him, but that their beauty would be preserved by a means of a wash." End quote. The recipe for this wash was likely one of the recipes he promised to deliver to the French royal family. At the time, most people believed in the existence of such a legendary liquid, one that had only been created a handful of times in history, and only ever by master alchemists, which the Count of Saint Germain was. In alchemy, this liquid is known as the elixir of life. So let's back up a bit and talk briefly about alchemy. What is alchemy? Well, alchemy turned into what we know today as chemistry. However, where chemistry is a hard science, alchemy is an occult science, as well as an ancient branch of natural philosophy. Like chemical combinations, alchemy combined laboratory experimentation with spiritual and metaphysical concepts. The ultimate goal of alchemy, its great work or magnum opus, was the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, which was less of a stone and more of a chemical substance imbued with almost magical properties. The Philosopher's Stone was said to be the key to turning base metals such as lead into gold. And the same substance was also believed to be the key ingredient in the elixir of life, a potion that supposedly grants the drinker immortality. Alchemy is one of the oldest occult sciences that has been continually studied, practiced, and built upon, with the first documented techniques found in ancient Egypt some 5,000 years ago. However, the ancient Egyptians had learned their foundational techniques from Mesopotamia, the true birthplace of alchemy. Interestingly, the first accepted reference to the elixir of life is found in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero Gilgamesh seeks out a man named Utnapishtim, who had achieved immortality. Utnapishtim then instructs Gilgamesh to find a specific box-thorn-like plant at the bottom of the sea and consume it for eternal life. The idea that the elixir of life was more than just a plant, but a potion, would come some centuries later. But the strange part about it is that this idea of a drinkable potion that could grant eternal life was independently invented at least 3 times. The first in what is modern day Iraq, the second either in India or China, and the third in Japan. Ancient Vedic scriptures describe the elixir of life in detail, and Amrita, as the elixir is called, remains a key concept in multiple Indian religions, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. Even the tiniest sip of Amrita would grant immortality. In ancient China, Qin Shi Huang, the founder of the Qing dynasty, sent his Taoist alchemist Xu Fu and armies of literally thousands to find the correct substance to form the elixir, all to no avail. His ancient ancestors had developed theories, though, that certain precious substances, when turned into a drink, would bestow eternal life. Ironically, this idea would result in the death of multiple Chinese emperors who ingested elixirs made from poisonous substances such as mercury. As the intrigue of alchemy spread across the world, and especially into Europe, the elixir of life remained in the realm of feasibility. It was just a matter of the mastery of alchemy and formulating a recipe using the right substance, perhaps the boxthorn-like plant sought out by Gilgamesh. After all, if modern chemistry can create medicine to cure disease, and gerontologists, scientists who study aging, now speak of aging as if it were a disease, why would curing the aging process be outside the realm of possibility? If immortality still seems ridiculous, we can simply ask the tech multi-billionaires of today why they invest so much into anti-aging. Larry Page and Sergey Brin of Google, Peter Thiel of the PayPal Mafia, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and Larry Ellison of Oracle have each invested tens of millions, and that's still a lowball figure. Larry Ellison in particular has invested at least 370 million US dollars into anti-aging. It may sound obvious, but many medicines are just a mixture of chemicals, and most medicines are built off of existing chemical knowledge, then finally experimented with using trial and error until they achieve the desired effect. This is the same process of alchemy, except alchemy is far older than modern medicine, and much like big pharmaceutical companies today, alchemists tended to guard their work in heavy secrecy, only to a far more extreme degree, and this is evident in how many alchemical writings have been coded using ciphers and symbolism. So for thousands of years, legends have stood regarding ancient alchemical secrets and achievements. Some alchemists such as Hermes Trismegistus and Nicholas Flamel are rumored to have achieved their magnum opus and successfully concocted the elixir of life, going on to live for eternity. And one other figure among them is the Count of Saint Germain. That vial of liquid he carried with him may have been the answer as to why he perfected so many skills, spoke so many languages, accumulated his immense wealth, and had endless stories and histories to tell. Simply put, the Count was a man who was too good to be true, and that's how he amazed the most powerful people in the world. Even though many thought he was lying about his age, Casanova included, and some thought he was insane, like Horace Walpole, not a single person left his company able to explain how the Count was the man he was. Casanova summed this up quite well, quote, "In spite of my own feelings, I thought him an astonishing man, as he was always astonishing me." End quote. For some, immortality seemed to be the only reasonable explanation, and many of the people who met and knew the Count genuinely believed that liquid was what kept him alive. After all, despite the Count's love for dinner parties, not a single person ever saw him eat, not even as a guest at the king's table. Seriously. Remember, Casanova mentioned how at the dinner table, the Count talked from the beginning of the meal to the end, instead of eating. And while at a dinner party in Vienna, the Count himself once boasted, quote, "Has anyone ever seen me eat or drink?" End quote. Indeed, this was a baffling part of his reputation. He would both attend and host lavish dinners with many guests and never touch a single dish. Obviously, he had to eat something, so he explained to people that his principal food was a simple mixture of oatmeal, which he prepared himself and consumed in private. You need to add liquid to raw oats in order to make oatmeal, so what liquid do you think he used? Madame de Gergy, a French socialite, once told Madame de Pompadour that the Count of Saint Germain had given her some of his special liquid in a bottle, and promised that it would preserve her appearance as a beautiful 25-year-old woman. She told de Pompadour that she cherished the gift but was afraid to drink it. Later on, de Pompadour would ask the Count about his gift to Madame de Gergy and whether this liquid of his could truly grant eternal youth. The Count simply replied, quote, "It is not impossible, but I confess it is likely that this lady, for whom I have the greatest respect, is talking nonsense." End quote. Madame de Gergy had lied about the gift, but his possession of the elixir of immortality, well, it was not impossible. The Count's stay in the French royal court might have been the height of his fame as a celebrity, but it was only the beginning of his true influence on European politics and history. As I mentioned earlier, the surprisingly close friendship and trust shared between the French king Louis XV and the Count of Saint Germain stirred immense jealousy in the king's court, and it wasn't long before certain powerful figures began to make plans toward his demise. Specifically, in 1760, the Minister of the State, the Duke of Choiseul, accused the Count of espionage. And it wasn't hard to convince others who had never met the Count that a man who refuses to give his birth date, background, and real name and ascended to such a high position in a matter of less than a year was a spy. However, Louis XV was offended by such an accusation against his friend and provided the Count with legal protection. Moreover, Louis did not agree with the Duke of Choiseul's policy regarding Austria, so he decided to send the Count, his personal diplomat, to Holland in order to secretly begin peace negotiations with Prince Louis of Brunswick regarding Austria. Someone eventually informed the Duke of Choiseul, though, and frothing with rage, he became all the more determined to see the Count of Saint Germain to his doom. While on this secret mission in Holland, the Count did what he perhaps does best. He obscured his identity, first pretending that he came from the French royal treasury to borrow money for Louis XV. Interestingly, the Count put down a mass of diamonds as collateral, diamonds that were his own and not Louis's, and this quickly made him friends with the Dutch bankers Adrian and Thomas Hope, with whom he stayed. All was going according to plan, that is, until an anonymous contact informed the French minister in Holland, Monsieur de Affre, of the secret negotiation that was to take place in his jurisdiction without his permission or knowledge. This outraged de Affre, and he complained to the French Minister of State, who was, you guessed it, the Duke of Choiseul. The Duke immediately sent orders to the Dutch government, demanding the arrest and extradition of the Count of Saint Germain. The Duke then waited until the next Royal Council meeting, and in front of all the ministers of the French Council, he informed King Louis of the decision to arrest the Count. Because this was a top secret mission, the king wouldn't dare to admit in front of his council of ministers that he was central to this scandal. Thus, Louis's hands were tied. He put all blame on the Count and allowed the arrest to happen. Here's where the historical details get fuzzy though. The Count escaped, but there are two versions of exactly how it all went down. The first account tells that the Dutch authorities regarded this arrest warrant as internal French politicking. Basically, it was France's problem and not something that Holland should get involved with. However, it would be politically unwise to directly refuse to deport the Count. So, to preserve the peace, the Dutch asked Britain for help, and the Brits sent the Count a blank British passport that he could fill in with any name he chose, which honestly sounds like a dream for a man with a pesky habit of vanishing. The second version of the story, though, is my personal favorite, and the one I hope is true. In this account, an anonymous contact, perhaps Louis XV, sent word to Giacomo Casanova, who happened to be staying in a hotel right next to where the Count was staying. So Casanova visited his rival and warned him of the arrest that was coming. The ending of both versions is the same. The Count of Saint Germain boarded a ship that was bound for England, and he would not be heard from or seen for at least a year. When he did reappear, though, the Count was more enigmatic than ever, and fair warning, with his return comes a confusing and stark tonal shift in our story toward more profound historical events, mystical dealings, and hidden influence, showing us a side of the Count that will be increasingly relevant from this point forward. Over the next 17 years, the Count of Saint Germain would pop up across Europe, in each location meeting with powerful figures, then disappearing almost as suddenly as he showed up. This happened so frequently that Europe whispered with rumors beyond that of immortality. People began to think he could teleport. Indeed, the Count showed up in St. Petersburg, Berlin, Vienna, Milan, Amsterdam, Venice, Nuremberg, and at least 6 other major European cities. Many of these places were the home to the royal families of their respective countries, which makes it all the more strange that major historical events seem to follow the Count wherever he went. For example, while in St. Petersburg, Russia, he met with Catherine the Great. Not much is known about this meeting, but today some theorize that the Count may have either inspired or helped conduct her successful takeover of Russia in 1762, when she overthrew her husband, Peter III, from the throne and crowned herself empress. The scant but compelling evidence for this was that Count Alexei Orlov, a close comrade of Catherine the Great, met with the Count of Saint Germain a few years later in Italy and said of him, quote, "Here is a man who played an important part in our revolution." End quote. Alexei's brother, Gregory Orlov, then handed the Count a case containing 20,000 gold coins. Why this gift or payment was made remains unclear, but it's not hard to put 2 and 2 together. Certainly, the details of this time period in the Count's life are hazy and subject to a lot of hearsay and legend, but yet another rumor began to be attached to his story, and that was that the Count of Saint Germain had become a leading figure in multiple major occult movements, including the Rosicrucian Order and Freemasonry. I'm saving those two for later though, as there's actually some pretty intriguing arguments that I want to get into, despite the lack of any hard evidence. Historically speaking though, there is documentation that during the Count's time in Vienna, he participated in founding 2 occult groups. The first known as the Society of Asiatic Brothers, and the second known as the Knights of Light. And both of these groups focused on the study of alchemy. In Germany, he was also spotted several times in the company of the hypnotist Franz Mesmer, and soon after these sightings, Mesmer would come up with the theory that there was an invisible energy possessed and emitted by all living things, and that this energy could create physical effects such as healing when harnessed. Thus, rumor has it that this theory, which is called animal magnetism, was inspired or even given to him by the Count of Saint Germain. Finally, there is a very strange story recorded in detail by the French Comtesse Gabrielle Pauline d'Adhémar. In 1774, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had ascended to the French throne, and not long after, the Count apparently returned to France and attempted to meet with them. It had been 14 years since his arrest warrant in Holland, and in that time he had become a sort of legend in the royal court due to his inexplicable friendship with the previous king, Louis XV. With the new ruling powers though, his point of contact was Comtesse d'Adhémar, who was the lady-in-waiting to Queen Marie Antoinette, and she helped him arrange a meeting with the Queen. According to d'Adhémar's own records, the Count wasn't his fun-loving self at all during this visit, as he had come to deliver a grave warning in the form of prophetic visions that would occur 15 years into the future. Comtesse d'Adhémar recorded the entire conversation in detail, which was essentially a vague but accurate portrayal of the political struggle to come that would eventually lead to the French Revolution. He ended his prophecy by saying, quote, "Not for long will the laws remain the protection of the good and the terror of the wicked. The wicked will seize power with blood-stained hands. They will do away with the Catholic religion, the nobility, and the magistracy. Not even royalty will be left. There will be a bloodthirsty republic, whose scepter will be the executioner's knife." End quote. Indeed, the French Revolution, which began in 1789 and ended in 1799, would lead to the overthrow of the existing French monarchy, the loss of state control of the Catholic Church, and the execution of both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette by guillotine. So, either the Comtesse d'Adhémar lied about the Count's visit and her prophecy in her memoirs, or the Count of Saint-Germain possessed a genuine power of precognition, the ability to foresee the future. While those 17 mysterious years through Europe are subject to much debate, thankfully the accepted historical documentation of the Count of Saint-Germain becomes re-established in the year 1779, when he arrived in Altona, today a city in Germany, though apparently he had been in Germany for the previous 3 years, under the name Count Weldon, selling alchemical recipes for rare cosmetics and dyes, just as he had during his early days in France. However, in Altona, he introduced himself as the Count of Saint-Germain to Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, who he likely met through one of the several secret societies they were both involved in. The Count showed the prince several of his most precious gemstones, then demonstrated his skills in alchemy. This apparently impressed Prince Charles so much that he immediately purchased a factory in the nearby town of Eckernförde for the Count, and supplied him with all the materials he needed to create his special dyes. It was far more than business, though. These two would become such good friends that the prince went on to construct a full-scale laboratory inside his own summer home so that the Count of Saint-Germain could conduct more elaborate alchemical experiments. And Charles would join the Count in the laboratory quite often, and together they created gemstones and jewelry. And this was how the Count of Saint-Germain spent his so-called last years. In 1784, something happened that should never happen to an immortal. The Count of Saint-Germain died. For a man who apparently survived solely off of oatmeal, he must have not had enough nutrition to support a healthy immune system, because he became deathly sick from pneumonia. Well, according to Prince Charles. Allegedly, during this time, the Count had become bedridden with his illness and announced to the prince that he was tired of life. He seemed quite depressed and refused to see a doctor, and the only people he allowed to tend to his ailments were women. Finally, he called Prince Charles over to his bedside in order to make a confession, the true identity of the man who called himself the Count of Saint-Germain. The Count revealed to the prince that he was an exiled royal of Transylvania, the eldest son of Prince Francis Rákóczi II. He said that he spent many of his younger years at the University of Siena in Italy, which at the time was considered the best education anyone could get, and he graduated with honors in multiple subjects, hence his incredible range of knowledge and skill. By the way, this claimed identity is absolutely vital to this mystery, and we'll be investigating it in depth at the end. After this confession was made, Prince Charles and the many ladies left him to rest. The Count of Saint-Germain would then proceed to die alone, with no one there to witness it. He was buried soon after in an unmarked grave, and later, all of his belongings were auctioned off, with the exception of a packet of secret documents that was given to Prince Charles. Among the Count's belongings were basic clothing, a few shillings, a toothbrush, a comb, and a few other sundries. Notably, no gold, jewels, or diamonds that he possessed were listed in his belongings, nor personal items such as his precious violin. The Count never married or had any children, well, as far as anyone knows. Casanova might have disagreed, but during the Count's life, he claimed to be a celibate, which meant he had no sex. What's clear, though, is that his death revealed about as much as his life. That is to say, we're not left with many answers, only more mysteries. 1784 marks the end of the confirmed historical existence of the Count of Saint Germain. However, despite having apparently died, immortality seems to make death a bit of a difficult task. Official Freemason documents record the Count of Saint Germain as the chosen representative of the French Masons for a major convention that took place in 1785, just 1 year after his reported death, and at this convention, both Alessandro Cagliostro and Franz Mesmer were present, both of whom had associated with the Count during his life. The Freemasons are, of course, a secret society, so whether the Count actually showed up is unknown, at least to the public. However, it wouldn't be long before reports of genuine appearances began to surface. The Comtesse d'Adhémar, the same who arranged the prophetic meeting between the Count and Marie Antoinette, claimed to have had a long conversation with him in 1789 in the Church of the Recollet after the revolutionary events of the storming of the Bastille. She wrote that his face looked no older than it had when she last saw him 15 years prior, and apparently he told her that he had just returned from a lengthy voyage across China and Japan. The Comtesse d'Adhémar is perhaps our primary and most detailed source for most of the sightings after the Count's reported death, so whether or not you trust her is up to you. But if she is telling the truth, we may be dealing with a genuine immortal. Some 30 years later, in 1821, the Comtesse d'Adhémar would write in her diary, quote, "I have seen Saint Germain again, each time to my amazement. I saw him when the Queen was murdered, on the 18th of Brumaire, on the day following the death of the Duc d'Enghien in January 1815, and on the eve of the murder of the Duc de Berry." End quote. All of these dates she mentioned, by the way, were incredibly important events that would dramatically change the governing system of France, as well as produce tremendous ripples across Europe. While the Count was certainly a political influence in his known life, these claims by d'Adhémar would essentially elevate his status from an immortal eccentric alchemist to something of a much more profound purpose, a being capable of not only changing entire political landscapes, but creating a future as he sees fit. That definitely qualifies as a demigod, which is why, as you'll see, there are entire religions in which the Count of Saint Germain is a central figure. All things make sense in context, and you can see how the truth or lore of d'Adhémar's claims are so vitally important. However, the documentation that seems to indicate that the Count was involved in the rise of Catherine the Great in Russia, that's strangely consistent with the records given by d'Adhémar. Make of that what you will. I won't go into the less notable claims of meetings and sightings, because there were many, and some are more or less believable than others. And these rumors went on with such regularity that the first president of France, Napoleon III, actually ordered one of his librarians to collect as much information on the Count of Saint Germain as possible, instructing them to dig into France's old archives, particularly those from the era of Louis XV. The Count's reputation certainly preceded him during the centuries after his supposed death, especially that of his claimed longevity. His unwitnessed death in Eckernförde, his unmarked burial plot, and his missing personal items such as his beloved violin, jewel collection, and paintings didn't satisfy anyone. The posthumous sightings of him alive were mere icing on the enigma cake. As the possibility that Europe was dealing with a real-life immortal grew, people began to take the rumors that the Count had achieved alchemy's magnum opus far more seriously. And I'll be honest with you though, if we were to take a leap and believe in immortality, alchemy may be the answer here. We already briefly discussed the scientific plausibility of anti-aging, which is accepted today by both gerontologists and some of the most powerful leaders of the technology sector. And we know for a fact that, all legends aside, the Count of Saint Germain was an incredible alchemist who managed to impress on the very first demonstration every single time. You may not expect it, but the strongest evidence for the elixir of life are those jewels the Count was famous for, the ones he loved to show off in every way imaginable. However vain it may sound, we know by now that this intense love of jewels perfectly fits the Count's flamboyant, room-commanding personality. Everything about him was over the top. The Count was eccentric for sure, but there is no denying that his jewel situation was suspicious. For example, his favorite articles of clothing all had precious gems sewn into them. He also fit a ridiculous number of diamonds into his shoes and garters, and those alone were thought to be worth more than 200,000 francs, which, if my calculations are correct, was well over $100,000 today. He also carried a casket filled with diamonds everywhere he went, which, as you remember, was used as collateral during his stay with the Dutch bankers while on his secret mission in Holland. His love for jewels was such an important part of who he was that the Count even included them in his original artworks. According to the memoirs of Baron de Gleichen, the royal who visited the Count's home, the figures the Count painted were covered in jewels with colors so vivid that the subject's face looked pale in comparison. Though, as we learned, none of his paintings survived, so we're only left to imagine. I'll tell you a real mystery though. Where in the world did the Count keep his vast amounts of wealth? Surely it was far more than the casket of diamonds he carried around. However, no bank account has ever been linked to any of his known aliases. Regardless, this man was beyond wealthy. He literally gave away precious gems to people who amused him. In one instance, he gave away a golden cross that was ornamented with white and green gems to Madame de Haussett, a woman he had just met, simply because she commented on his beauty. Believing that the stones were fake, she later had the cross valued and all were confirmed as genuine. The Count also presented his friend Louis XV with a large diamond worth 10,000 livres, which is an old and confusing French currency, but I believe it converts to nearly $21,000 today. It is true that the Count sold rare dyes and owned a factory, but he was independently wealthy before this, and not a single soul knew where it all came from. So, here's where the alchemy comes into play. Above all other talents, the Count was most respected for his mastery of alchemy, and we remember that the Philosopher's Stone, the legendary ingredient of the elixir of life, is also the key to transmuting base metals into gold. So perhaps this would have been an easy answer to account for his otherwise inexplicable wealth, which he seemed to have an endless supply of, and never was he seen withdrawing from a bank. Thus, if the legend of the Philosopher's Stone is true, the Count may have literally been creating his own money through alchemy. And as for his diamonds, Casanova wrote in his memoirs that the Count openly claimed that, quote, he could melt diamonds, professing himself capable of forming out of 10 or 12 small diamonds, one large one of the finest water without any loss of weight, end quote. Beyond this, the Count made other alchemical claims, such as his ability to remove flaws from diamonds, as well as increase the size of pearls. And as for the pearls, those in his possession were said to be remarkably large. As is believed in alchemical tradition, if a person is capable of creating gold or manipulating diamonds through alchemy, they almost definitely possess a secret of the Philosopher's Stone, which in turn makes it likely they achieved immortality through the elixir of life as well. One medieval alchemist in particular is thought to have achieved this, and his name is Nicholas Flamel. During his lifetime, Flamel was a manuscript seller who was in possession of some of the most rare and treasured alchemical texts, and later he was noted for his immense wealth and generosity. Some 200 years after Flamel's historically accepted death, a large number of complex alchemical texts appeared that were attributed to him. and they revealed a very different story of a man history almost entirely overlooked. According to the text, in the year 1378, Flamel came into possession of a mysterious and ancient 21-page manuscript. He traveled to Spain for help with translation, but along the way he met a wandering Christian convert of Jewish descent who was able to identify certain key aspects of the manuscript, so much so that Flamel himself could begin decoding the text. So for the next few years, Flamel and his wife decoded all 21 pages, and in them they discovered a hidden recipe for the Philosopher's Stone, which they proceeded to recreate in their lab. In 1382, they successfully produced silver, and not long after, they produced gold. By association, alchemists who read these texts on Flamel's secret discovery concluded that Flamel had also produced the elixir of life, as it was the obvious next step, having created the Philosopher's Stone. Though the story of Nicholas Flamel is of controversial origin, it's never been fully debunked, and many have even argued for its authenticity. Flamel was indeed a real person in history too, and one of the most popular theories of who the Count of Saint-Germain may have actually been. After his historical yet questionable death, what became of increasing relevance was the Count's deep involvement in occult groups and secret societies during his life, especially for someone who, according to Casanova, claimed to possess a mastery over Mother Nature. We're talking about some seriously ancient and esoteric knowledge, exactly the kind that these secret societies concern themselves with. I already mentioned that the Count of Saint-Germain helped found the Society of Asiatic Brothers, as well as the Knights of Light sometime in the late 1760s. As far as I can tell, neither of these groups have survived into modern day, but it's quite possible that one or both were absorbed into a larger group, and two groups during that time were gaining immense traction in the occult community. I'm speaking of the Rosicrucian Order, as well as Freemasonry. As for the Rosicrucian Order, they were a group that, since their founding in the early 1600s, and possibly as early as 1407 if you ask the Rosicrucians, they claimed to possess esoteric wisdom that derived from the ancient past, but more than spiritual knowledge, they spoke of tangible insight into the physical universe that has been deliberately hidden from the average man for thousands of years. Alchemy, alongside occult magic such as Kabbalah, were central to this sort of manipulation of nature. While during his lifetime, the Count never admitted to practicing Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism and a system of practical magic. Many, such as the Marquis de Crequi, speculated that the Count was, in fact, of Jewish descent. Likewise, many do believe that he had some involvement with the Rosicrucian Order. However, there is no proof, except in the writings of the influential Rosicrucian Max Heindel, where Heindel describes the Count of Saint-Germain as a reincarnation of Christian Rosenkreuz, the enigmatic and somewhat mythological founder of the Rosicrucians. Regarding the Freemasons, though, there is far more for us to go off of. Though most modern Masons deny that the Count had any involvement in Freemasonry, there is the matter of that official document from 1785 that listed him as a representative of the French Masons. Then there is the influential Freemason, as well as fellow alchemist Alessandro Cagliostro, who wrote in his memoirs that the Count of Saint-Germain founded the Freemason Lodge in Germany. Moreover, Cagliostro revealed that the Count was the very reason he himself even joined the Masons in the first place. The two first met in London during the Count's second visit there in May of 1760, where they bonded over their shared occult knowledge, especially that of alchemy. According to Cagliostro's memoirs, the Count became his mentor and was the one to initiate him in the Masonic rite, known as the ancient and primitive rite of Memphis Misraim. And just like the Count, Cagliostro would then go on to become extremely famous across Europe, especially among the royal elite, so much so that he was recommended as a personal physician to the American statesman Benjamin Franklin during his stay in Paris. And that last detail on Benjamin Franklin brings us to our next Masonic rumor. One of the most popular and wild legends of the Count of Saint Germain is that he assisted in the creation of the American Constitution. Frankly, there is zero proof of this, but you take a man who has a history of powerful political influence, who was also apparently a highly esteemed member of the Freemasons, and then consider that the Freemasons were an international secret society that included a surprising number of the famous forefathers of American political history. Confirmed members of the Freemasons include George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, and John Hancock. However, the Freemasons were and remain a secret society, so these are only names that are actually confirmed. Many others have been speculated. Regardless, historians today believe that 9 of the 56 men that signed the Declaration of Independence were Masons, and 13 of the 39 that signed the US Constitution were also Masons. Whether the Count of Saint Germain had any influence on American history remains entirely unknown, but the timeline does seem to match up. Returning back to his mentorship of the alchemist Alessandro Cagliostro, there is a theory that they co-authored a document known as the Most Holy Trina Sophia. Trina Sophia meaning threefold wisdom. The Trina Sophia is a highly coded text that is written in an elaborate mixture of French, Arabic, Chaldean Hebrew, cuneiform, Ionic Greek, Syriac, and esoteric hieroglyphs. In modern day, the contents have been successfully translated, revealing a ritual Egyptian magical treatise, as well as a complex chemical allegory, which was an alchemist's ideal way to pass on their most prized alchemical secrets, as only the worthy would ever understand. The Trina Sophia remains a central codex in both Masonic and Rosicrucian studies, and the only surviving copy of this text is held in the library of Troyes, France. No one knows for sure who authored the Trina Sophia, though in the front of this copy is a bookseller's note stating explicitly that it is the sole existing copy of the famous Trina Sophia of the Comte de Saint-Germain, as the original was destroyed by the Count himself. This note also adds that Cagliostro had owned this volume, which was seized from him during his arrest by the Catholic Church in 1789 during the Inquisition in Rome. This arrest and seizure of books definitely happened, and interestingly, it was due to Cagliostro trying to found a Freemason lodge in Rome. It also resulted in him being sentenced to death. One of the foremost authorities in ancient occultism, Manly P. Hall, wrote of the mysterious author of the Trina Sophia, quote, "The personage who gathered the material in this manuscript was indeed one whose spiritual understanding might be envied. He found these various texts in different parts of Europe, no doubt, and that he had a true knowledge of their import is proved by the fact that he attempted to conceal some 40 fragmentary ancient texts by scattering them within the lines of his own writing." End quote. If the Count of Saint Germain authored or co-authored this book alongside Cagliostro, it would be the Count's only known occult writing from his historical lifetime. It's now time to make crystal clear just how profound the influence of the Count of Saint Germain was in the occult world after his historical death. Though he may have involved himself with the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians during his life, and possibly after, the occult religion known as Theosophy takes this mystical side of the Count to an entirely different level. Some may even say that Theosophy deified him, and certainly some offshoot sects of Theosophy today, such as the so-called I Am activity, quite literally worship him. All Theosophists, though, regardless of sect, assert that the Count of Saint Germain is still alive. Theosophy considers the Count of Saint Germain to be a master of ancient wisdom, which is a central concept in their religion. The Masters of Ancient Wisdom are supposed to be a group of enlightened beings who are credited with godlike powers, such as that of teleportation, levitation, passing through walls, telepathic communication, and, of course, the ability to live incredibly long lives. Note that the Masters are not thought to be immortal. More on that in a bit. According to Theosophy, the greatest masters to ever live include the Hindu deity Krishna, the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama, and Jesus Christ. Generally speaking, the goal of these masters is to steer humanity by way of secretly influencing events and manipulating the course of history, something which absolutely reflects many of the older legends of the Count of Saint Germain. Between the years of 1849 and 1869, the Masters of Ancient Wisdom decided to communicate their sacred knowledge, that which led them to true enlightenment, to the future founder of Theosophy, a Russian woman named Helena Blavatsky. For many years, Blavatsky studied under them in Tibet and recorded her conversations with them privately. It was only later that she convinced two of the masters to open communication with two of her most trusted colleagues, and finally the existence of the masters was revealed to the public at large, and the occult religion known as Theosophy was born. The Count of Saint Germain was not one of these original two masters, but he is considered among their enlightened rank, and apparently he did eventually communicate with the influential theosophists Charles Ledbetter and Guy Ballard. Both of these people claim to have met the Count well after his supposed death, with significant documentation to go along with it. Helena Blavatsky herself claimed to have met the Count too. In fact, there is a mysterious photo supposedly of them together, alongside two other masters of ancient wisdom named Kuthumi and Moria. Blavatsky also claimed to be in possession of a number of secret documents written by the Count, which she used in her theosophical teachings. So, Charles Ledbetter's encounter occurred in 1926, when he met the Count of Saint Germain in Rome. He described the Count as having brown eyes, olive-colored skin, and a pointed beard, and that his presence commanded intense and forceful reverence, as was expected by a master of ancient wisdom. Ledbetter went on to say that the Count told him that he now lives in a castle in Transylvania, where he practices occult rituals while wearing a special outfit, which he then showed to Ledbetter. Ledbetter described this artifact as, quote, a suit of golden chainmail which once belonged to a Roman emperor. Over it is thrown a magnificent cloak of Tyrian purple, with on its clasp a seven-pointed star in diamond and amethyst, and sometimes he wears a glorious robe of violet, end quote. This color, violet, the color of amethyst, is today an essential trait associated with the Master of Wisdom, the Count of Saint Germain. In Theosophy, he is sometimes referred to as the Violet Flame, and as the Master of the Seventh Ray. These seven rays are supposedly seven metaphysical principles that govern the unfolding of each astrological age, each of which are exactly 2,158 years long, and the seventh ray is supposed to be violet in color. As for Guy Ballard's encounter with the Count of Saint Germain, his became far more prolific than Ledbetter's, so much so that it actually spun off into its own religion. Honestly speaking though, Ballard's story is weird. In 1930, Guy Ballard was living at the base of Mount Shasta, an active volcano in California that's been associated with strange paranormal activity dating back to the Native American tribes who originally inhabited the area. I promise I'll eventually investigate Mount Shasta in depth, as is one of my most requested topics, but for now, this is where Guy Ballard both lived and loved to hike. And it was during one of his hikes that his haunting encounter with the Count of Saint Germain happened. Ballard records, quote, it came time for lunch, and I sought a mountain spring for clear, cold water. Cup in hand, I bent down to fill it, when an electrical current passed through my body from head to toe. I looked around, and directly behind me stood a young man who, at first glance, seemed to be someone on a hike like myself. I looked more closely and realized immediately that he was no ordinary person. As this thought passed through my mind, he smiled and addressed me, saying, my brother, if you will hand me your cup, I will give you a much more refreshing drink than spring water. I obeyed, and instantly the cup was filled with a creamy liquid. Handing it back to me, he said, drink it, end quote. Ballard would supposedly go on to have a number of meetings and communications with this man, who later identified himself as the Count of Saint Germain. Apparently, the Count had chosen Guy Ballard, his wife Edna, and later his son, Edona, as his sole accredited messengers. Together, they published many books containing his philosophical and spiritual teachings, known as the Saint Germain series, and Ballard himself lectured tirelessly, establishing a movement he called the I Am activity. If you're wondering, I Am refers to an ancient Sanskrit mantra, Soham, which essentially means I am that I am. By 1938, Ballard's I Am activity had accumulated well over 1 million followers, and it still exists today, operated by its parent organization, the Saint Germain Foundation. Be warned though, the I Am activity is a considerably more cultish offshoot of Theosophy, so we should return back to the core of what were Theosophy's original beliefs regarding the Count of Saint Germain, and those come from the founder of Theosophy, the adept of the Masters of Ancient Wisdom, Helena Blavatsky. In May of 1881, Blavatsky wrote an article for her publication, The Theosophist, describing her thoughts on the Count at length. Quote, "The Count Saint Germain is, until this very time, a living mystery. The countless authorities we have in literature, as well as in oral tradition, which is sometimes the more trustworthy, about this wonderful Count's having been met and recognized in different centuries, is no myth. This pupil of Hindu and Egyptian hierophants, this holder of the secret knowledge of the East, was not appreciated for who he was. The stupid world has always treated in this way men who, like Saint Germain, have returned to it after long years of seclusion devoted to study, with their hands full of the treasure of esoteric wisdom and with the hope of making the world better, wiser, and happier." End quote. I promised that I would explain the concept that none of the Masters of Ancient Wisdom are immortal, including the Count of Saint Germain, which is notable as we're talking about a highly mystical religion that absolutely asserts the reality of supernatural power. Some theosophists have implied that the Masters can live for up to 1,000 years, but even that's apparently an exaggeration. According to Blavatsky herself, quote, "The Masters' knowledge and learning are immense, and their personal holiness of life is still greater. Still, they are mortal men, and none of them 1,000 years old, as imagined by some. I have never heard of a mortal man, layman or adept, who could live even half the 969 years allotted to Methuselah. Some adepts do exceed, by a good deal, what you would call the ordinary age, yet there is nothing miraculous in it, and very few of them care to live very long." End quote. So, let's do some math. We know that the Count first appeared in England sometime in the early 1740s, and by then he was already a grown man, described as looking around 40 years old. So if we estimate that he was born in 1710 at the latest, and he's still around today, that would make him around 312 years old, as of the making of this video. Blavatsky also made a reference to Methuselah, a biblical figure written to have lived 969 years, and said that no master has ever come even close to half of that, which is 484 and a half years. Therefore, according to Helena Blavatsky, the Count of Saint Germain today has around 100 to an upper limit of 172 years left to live. That is, if he cares enough to live that long. Of course, if the Count truly was a master of ancient wisdom, he could have been born much earlier than 1710, and this leads us to our final discussion. That is the origin of the Count of Saint Germain, and finally the most compelling case for his true identity. Alchemy, magic, and theosophy aside, the most important question we can ask today is the one with which we began. That is, who was the Count of Saint Germain? Speaking literally, every man, even one who achieved immortality, has a beginning. Thus, many people have speculated on the early life of the Count, as it likely holds the key to this entire mystery. Like his birth date, the birthplace of the Count of Saint Germain is unknown. But Horace Walpole did include an interesting hint, writing that, quote, Spanish or Portuguese seemed to be his natural language, end quote. Thus, according to the showman P.T. Barnum, people speculated that the Count was, quote, a Spanish Jesuit named Aymar, and others again intimate that his true title was the Marquis de Betmar, and that he was a native of Portugal, end quote. Besides the connection to Walpole's statement, there is almost no evidence to back up any of these claims, though. However, there are two people who, out of all those who befriended him, these two almost definitely knew the true identity of the Count of Saint Germain, with one hiding the secret for the rest of his life, and the other possibly letting it loose. The first person is King Louis XV. King Louis displayed such an intense respect and admiration for the Count that it shocked his court, and all things considered, it truly seemed like they were best friends. They enjoyed countless hours of conversation behind closed doors, and the king seemed to offer him legal protection that allowed the Count to continue obscuring his identity and past unhindered. Even President Napoleon III believed that Louis XV knew the Count's identity. This is why he sent his librarian on a mission to dig through Louis's archives. However, Louis never revealed the secret of the Count, nor a single detail of his true identity. The second suspect is Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, who the Count of Saint Germain spent his final years with. Despite the Count's reputation for exerting his superiority on just about everyone besides the king, he treated Prince Charles as a true equal, and it was Charles who the Count entrusted a number of secret documents to upon his death from pneumonia in 1784, and in a letter written 40 years later, in 1825, Prince Charles revealed to a friend that he was the only person who the Count truly confided in. Unlike Louis XV, Prince Charles did reveal the supposed true identity of the Count of Saint Germain. Charles said that on his deathbed, the Count revealed his greatest secret, that he was of royal Transylvanian blood, that he was the lost son of Prince Francis Rákóczi II. Here's a historical fact for you. The eldest son of Prince Francis Rákóczi II, whose name was Leopold George, was reported to have died at the age of 4. However, the final will of Rákóczi II includes this eldest son, despite him supposedly being dead. Now, why would a deceased prince's money and possessions be given to a long-deceased son? Well, maybe someone here wasn't really dead. Today, historians believe that Leopold George, who disappeared off record at the age of 4, was deliberately hidden and had his identity changed. But why? Well, it's thought that this was in order to spare Leopold from the persecutions that were ongoing against the Habsburg dynasty, of which focus was bound to turn toward him as the prince's eldest son. This is just speculation, though, as it's never been truly understood why Rákóczi II chose to hide only his eldest son. In 1911, a genealogy study was conducted by the theosophist Annie Besant that helped flesh out the events as they would have occurred. Despite Besant's involvement in theosophy, what her study found remains generally accepted by historians. The study revealed that the children of Prince Francis Rákóczi II were actually raised by the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I for their own protection, as it was a tumultuous time in Central Europe with many violent uprisings. For unknown reasons, though, at some point the eldest child, Leopold George, was withdrawn from the guardianship of the Holy Roman Emperor. Records show that the child had died, but we now know that wasn't the truth. The best theory that this genealogy study put forth is that the 4-year-old Leopold George was secretly delivered to Gian Gastone, the last descendant of the Medici family, who were an Italian banking dynasty. Allegedly, Gastone was Leopold's mother's brother-in-law. Gastone went on to raise Leopold in Italy, primarily in the little countryside town of San Germano, where Gastone owned his favorite estates. And San Germano, of course, is where Leopold picked up his most cherished pseudonym, the Count of Saint Germain. This would account for his incredible wealth, as not only did little Leopold have the patronage of his own father, Rakosi II, but we may also speculate that the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I and Gian Gastone, the final descendant of the Medici banking dynasty, may have gifted him access to wealth beyond most people's wildest dreams. It also explains his access to an incredibly broad and high-quality education, which occurred at the University of Siena, and possibly the powerful network of people he seemed to have almost direct access to. This theory that the Count of Saint Germain was, in fact, this hidden child, Leopold George, is the strongest theory we have today regarding his true identity, the one generally accepted by historians and theosophists alike, as well as what the Count himself admitted to while on his deathbed. However, the Count was an incredibly smart man who deliberately concealed his identity all throughout his known existence. So, who really knows if this is yet another elaborate tale he made up? A red herring to obscure his true identity forever, by intentionally piecing together a historically sensible answer. It should be said, though, that the Count of Saint Germain being the eldest son of Prince Francis Rakosi II doesn't debunk the possibility of immortality or longevity. If you believe in alchemy, anyone can drink the elixir of life, and if you're a theosophist, you know that, theoretically, anyone can achieve the enlightenment of a master of ancient wisdom. It's just extremely unlikely, and that's a massive understatement. Today, many still believe that the Count walks among us, simply going by a different name as he was known to do. In the memoirs of the Englishman, Albert Van Dam, published in 1892, he writes of a man he befriended in Paris, who was of average height, strong build, and appeared to be in the range of 40 to 50 years old. Quote, he called himself Major Fraser, lived alone, and never alluded to his family. Moreover, he was lavish with money, though the source of his fortune remained a mystery to everyone. He possessed a marvelous knowledge of all the countries in Europe at all periods. His memory was absolutely incredible, and curiously enough, he often gave his hearers to understand that he had acquired his learning elsewhere than from books. Many is the time he has told me, with a strange smile, that he was certain he had known Nero, had spoken with Dante, and so on. End quote. It's something of a comforting feeling, believing that the Count may still be living his strange and eccentric lifestyle somewhere to this day, adventuring and resting wherever he pleases, and inspiring all those he meets with his opulent jewels, fantastic stories, oatmeal mixtures, and loving ways with women. Though the true nature of the Count of Saint Germain is attested in the memoirs of his close friend, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel. Quote, he was perhaps one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, the friend of humanity, wishing for money only that he might give to the poor, a friend to animals. His heart was concerned only with the happiness of others. End quote. No matter what the truth is, the Count of Saint Germain certainly gained the immortality he always hinted at. He lives on today in legend, occult teachings, and historical mystery, and he continues to inspire countless people toward greater aspirations. In conclusion, the Count of Saint Germain is still alive today. If you enjoyed this investigation, I highly recommend you to watch my video Enochian, the Lost Language of Angels, for an equally unexplainable mystery and deep character study of one of my favorite people in all of European history, John Dee. Thank you to my patrons for making this extra long video a reality, and if you want to support my next major project, there's a link in the description. All proceeds go back to these videos. I'm Mr. Mythos. You guys are awesome. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
sent from God to a city of Galilee named
Every Sunday, in every corner of the world,
Virgin betrothed to a man whose
people
name,
gather to hear a story.
and the virgin's name was Mary.
For more than 2,000 years, that story has been told and retold.
And to bear a son.
Along the way, each generation has found in its telling its own meaning and interpretation.
You shall call his name Jesus.
That story of a man called Jesus of
This video is sponsored by this investigation is sponsored by established titles. Lucifer is a name you're probably familiar with. Lucifer is an angel in the Hebrew Bible whose fall from heaven is believed to have transformed him into Satan, the devil. He was once an exceptionally beautiful and powerful angel, and one of the closest to God. But in the end, his pride made him want to become like God, a forbidden desire that led God to cast him out and onto earth. The book of Revelation tells that 1/3 of God's angels followed Satan and fell with him. But this is just one story of a mass angelic fall in Abrahamic lore. Darker and more devious mythologies have been told of a certain 200 angels who formed a conspiracy to share forbidden knowledge and mate with human women, whose giant hybrid offspring cannibalized and drank each other's blood. These ancient writings had a surprisingly large influence on Judaism and the early Christian church, who later rejected them for their disturbing demonology. Just remember, there's nothing to fear. Mr. Mythos is here. But yes, we're gonna investigate it all. The fall of the 200, as well as the fall of Lucifer, in obsessive detail. But before we dive in, I want to talk about titles, a rather important thing in angelology and demonology. These range from the Archangel Michael, Chief Prince of Israel, to the demon Dagon, Grand Pantler of the royal household of Satan. I've skimmed entire grimoires of who's who in heaven and hell, but I have to say, nothing compares to having your own title, made official by today's sponsor, Established Titles. Yes, Lord Mythos of Scotland is back. I decree that you observe my certificate with its unique plot number. I own 1 square foot of dedicated land on a private estate in Scotland, and in Scottish custom, landowners are referred to. The term fallen angel doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible, nor in any other Abrahamic scripture. The description of angels falling, however, absolutely does. An angel always falls as a result of committing a sin, and usually a pretty bad one, but any sin will result in them being cast out of heaven. The Bible states that all angels were created sinless, but they do have free will. So the choice to commit a sin is always a fully conscious one, a thought-out act of rebellion, and thus the punishment is always severe. That said, the scripture describes 3 possible consequences. Some fallen angels are temporarily confined in the abyss. Others are eternally imprisoned in Tartarus, a place of punishment that the Greeks believed was worse than the hellscape Hades. And the rest are let loose to continue their sins on earth. They retain their angelic qualities of immortality and spiritual nature, but they lost their purity and heavenly position, and they'll never get them back. Fallen angels are unforgivable beings, and they all committed a sin. There's a big question on the table here. Are fallen angels demons? In my video last year, Demonology Explained in Obsessive Detail, I made one specific claim that many people disagreed with, the idea that demons are fallen angels. So let me just clear one thing up. In my demonology video, I was referring the traditional Christian belief. Today's video is very different. We'll be looking at descriptions of the origin of demons not actually found in the Bible, but in the Book of Enoch, more accurately known as First Enoch. Most churches today consider First Enoch to be apocryphal, or not part of the true biblical canon, but several denominations would strongly disagree. The Eritrean Orthodox Church and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, as well as the Beta Israel Jews, and so too would many early theologians of Christianity. First Enoch's oldest verses were written around 300 BC, and it wasn't until around 300 AD that most churches rejected it as scripture. Interestingly, the biblical epistle of Jude, written around 50 AD, actually quotes First Enoch directly, which is remarkably strong evidence that it belongs as part of biblical canon. That said, the book was problematic from the beginning. The main issue was that its content was not only incredibly controversial, but disturbing. Some 200 angels have sexual intercourse with human women, which results in God transforming those women into bird-like monstrosities, but not before they gave birth to a race of ultraviolent giants known as the Nephilim, whose hunger was so insatiable that they'd go on to devour animals, humans, and eventually each other, and drink the blood of their victims. In Jewish tradition, the act of drinking blood is believed to be the ultimate violation of God's living creations. But for Christians, one aspect would prove even more offensive. First Enoch described the first sin, the origin of all sin, as not from Adam and Eve, but from the fallen angels. So, who wrote this problematic text? Well, this brings us to one of the most mysterious figures in the Bible, the patriarch Enoch, who the Bible only mentions once. Quote, "And Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more, because God took him away." End quote. This passage makes Enoch one of only 3 humans to enter heaven alive, the other 2 being the prophet Elijah and Jesus Christ, according to Christian tradition. Clearly, Enoch was extremely important, yet the Bible fails to say anything else about him. But First Enoch does. In fact, it was supposedly written by him after his tour of heaven and return to Earth. According to the lore, out of the hundreds of texts he wrote, this was the only one to survive the flood God sent to reset the world, protected by his great-grandson Noah on his ark. Historically, though, this text would be lost for nearly 1,000 years, from the 9th century AD until 3 copies were rediscovered in 1773, all written in Ge'ez, an ancient Ethiopian Semitic language. It turned out that not only did the Ethiopians never lose it, but they continued to treat First Enoch as a core part of their biblical canon. Today, these Ethiopian copies are the only complete versions we've found, though its accuracy would be proven with the later discovery of far more ancient Aramaic fragments. First Enoch is important because it tells the story of the sins of the Watchers. So, who are the Watchers? Well, a Watcher is an angel whose job is to watch over humanity and influence people, and particularly world leaders, on orders from God. They're mentioned in accepted canon, with 3 specific mentions of these beings in the Bible's Book of Daniel. Suspiciously, in all 3 instances, the prophet Daniel goes out of his way to specify that the Watchers he's describing are holy ones, in those exact words. That clearly implies the existence of unholy Watchers, who the Bible never elaborates on. Or perhaps it does. The New Testament's epistle of Jude, the same I mentioned quoted First Enoch directly, went on to describe a certain group of angels who'd, quote, "given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh," end quote. To reveal the full story of the sins these fallen angels made and the monstrous consequences, we'll be exploring not only First Enoch, but other ancient Enochian works such as the Book of Giants and the Book of Jubilees. All truly apocalyptic mindbenders and largely rejected as canon. But First Enoch is where we'll begin, and specifically its first section, titled The Book of the Watchers. The Book of the Watchers takes place in an era several hundred years after creation and before the flood, a time when the world was very different from the way we know it from written history. People lived extraordinarily long lives in blissful innocence and ignorance. It wasn't strange for a human and an angel to freely interact with one another. God sent these angels, known as the Watchers, to do just this, to live among the people, watch them, and guide them. However, this would lead to a problem. Despite the difference in species, the Watchers eventually became sexually attracted to human women. The following verse from chapter 6 of the Book of the Watchers is almost exactly the same as that found in chapter 6 of the biblical book of Genesis, by the way, as well as the Enochian books of Jubilees and Giants. It's a defining and unforgettable introduction. Quote, "And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw them, and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children." End quote. The 69th chapter of 1st Enoch cites the angel Yacon as the first watcher to feel this temptation. Yacon approached the head chieftain of the Watchers, the angel Samyaza, to organize a large-scale conspiracy to perform the forbidden copulation. It's not explained how Yacon convinced Samyaza, only that it wasn't long before a dark alliance of exactly 200 Watchers gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon. Samyaza led the discussion. Quote, "I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." End quote. The chieftain was wrong. All 200 were equally wrapped up in temptation, and together they swore an oath to satisfy their carnal lusts and desires, and if caught, face the consequences together. And so they did. The Watchers flew down to Earth and each chose a wife for themselves and impregnated them. As these pregnancies progressed, the Watchers decided to share their heavenly secrets with their new wives. This was the introduction of forbidden knowledge into the world, that of the astrological signs and phases of the celestial bodies, that of sorcery and magical spells, and that of herbalism, metallurgy, and even the secret truth of humanity's divine origin. God would later identify the knowledge shared by the angel Azazel as the worst of all. Quote, "The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin." End quote. Azazel taught men metallurgy, how to create armor and weapons of war, and how to meld silver into jewelry to please women. Azazel would teach women the art of seductive cosmetics such as eye paints and makeup, precious stones, and clothing dyes. Thus, Azazel was thought to be the root of promiscuity and violence on Earth. The forbidden knowledge was shared with the Watchers' offspring once their wives died. But these children, unlike the mothers, were not exactly human. Birthed of an unnatural, unholy matrimony between spiritual and mortal beings, these creatures were the Nephilim. Enochian literature describes the Nephilim as the true origin of the evil spirits we know as demons. This would be the ultimate fate of their souls after death. But in life, the Nephilim were monstrous giants made of flesh and blood. Just as the fall of the Watchers is referenced in the biblical epistle of Jude, the birth of the Nephilim is mentioned in the book of Genesis. Quote, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them." End quote. This is the first of only 2 explicit references to these beings found in the Bible. While Genesis vaguely confirms their existence, the Book of Numbers makes it clear that the Nephilim are of gigantic stature. In this instance, several spies have been sent to survey Canaan, a land God promised to deliver to Israel. However, they were in for a big surprise. Quote, "There we saw the Nephilim, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, as so were we in their sight." End quote. The Book of the Watchers gives the Nephilim's exact height, 300 cubits, or around 450 feet tall. We can assume they weren't born that large, as the women survived the birth, but it does appear they grew up quickly. Their size, however, was a huge problem. Simply put, these 450-foot tall giants needed to be fed. Quote, the Nephilim consumed all of the acquisitions of men, and when the men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against the birds and beasts, and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. End quote. As most living beings do when faced with starvation, the Nephilim did what they had to do to survive, even resorting to violence. And the rampage of these desperate gigantic beings led to bloodshed and chaos across the earth. The conspiracy of the 200 Watchers hidden. Looking down from heaven, the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel saw the state of the world and were utterly horrified. Immediately, they approached God at his throne, reported what they saw, and begged him for divine intervention. The all-knowing God was aware and decreed the punishments they must carry out. Bind Samyaza and his associates who have defiled themselves with women, when their sons, the Nephilim, have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones. Bind these watchers for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment, when they shall be led off to the abyss of fire, to the torment and the prison in which they shall be confined forever. Bind us hand and foot, and make an opening in the desert, and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face so that he may not see light. End quote. The Archangel Gabriel then suggested that the Lord force the Nephilim into an endless and brutal civil war against each other, so that they may witness, suffer, and be the cause of the death of their own race. And God agreed to this idea. While the Nephilim would be faced with death, this death wouldn't be their final rest. God placed a curse on the Nephilim's spirit. God proceeded to make this declaration, quote, now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh of angel and human shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men and from the holy watchers, and they shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits they shall be called. End quote. God explained further that their disembodied spirits would suffer endless hunger and thirst to torment and enrage them, and their fury would be directed toward humans. Thus the Nephilim would be the origin of demons on Earth. There's much more to it though, so I saved an entire section in this video for these beings. As for the women who gave birth to the Nephilim, a later chapter of the Book of the Watchers reveals their punishment. Quote, the women of the angels who went astray shall become sirens. End quote. Sirens are hybrid creatures, half bird, half woman. We'll revisit them in a minute and their connection to the famous demon of Jewish folklore, Lilith. God's final punishment was ultimately something that all on the earth would suffer, including the innocent. To God, the fallen watchers and the Nephilim had corrupted the entire world to such a degree that the only option was a complete reset. The Great Deluge, a giant flood that would, quote, cleanse the earth from all impurity and from all wrong and from all lawlessness and from all sin and godlessness and all impurities that have come upon the earth. Remove. End quote. Nearly everything in existence would be killed and destroyed. Mankind could become righteous once again, but only with the earth wiped clean. God ordered the Archangel Uriel to fly down from heaven and warn the one person deemed worthy of survival, Enoch's great-grandson Noah, who'd be instructed to build an ark. The flood would unleash after a set number of years, and the clock was now ticking. In the meantime, God ordered Enoch himself to inform the watchers of their punishment to come. Enoch first approached Azazel. Then he announced it to the remaining 199 watchers together. Quote, They were all afraid, and fear and trembling seized them, and they besought me to draw upon a petition for them, that they might find forgiveness, and to read their petition in the presence of the Lord. End quote. God had cut off all communication with the fallen watchers, so Enoch was their only hope. Enoch heeded their desperate request and pleaded for their fate. However, their severe and everlasting punishment would not change. God would show them no mercy, and they would never be forgiven for their sin. I mentioned that we'd explore the fate of the fallen women, and how they were transformed into monstrosities the Book of the Watchers refers to as sirens. As for what sirens are in this context, that's a bit debatable. In the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, there's several mentions of sirens without explicit description, but a bit more context given than 1st Enoch. Scholars argue they might describe a female owl, ostrich, or human hybrid creature. However, all agree that this is some sort of female creature that wails and cries. In Greek mythology, though, sirens are far clearer. They were indeed hybrid monsters, half woman, half bird. They lived on islands in the ocean, and with their beautiful hypnotic voice, they'd lure sailors to wreck their ship on the island's rocky coastline. Thus, sirens could be interpreted as a type of demon. The most important work in Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, actually reflects this belief. And as a side note, one really strange thing about the Zohar is that its contents seem to express an in-depth knowledge of the traditions and details of 1st Enoch. It's a mystery how this is even possible, because the Zohar was written in the 13th century, and during that time it was believed that 1st Enoch was completely lost. Anyway, back to the sirens. The Zohar actually suggests that it was the women themselves who seduced the Watchers, not the other way around. The first woman to do this was named Naamah. Quote, Naamah, the mother of the demons, by whom the first saints were seduced. She, Naamah, by her beauty, led astray the sons of God, Samyaza and Azazel, and she bore them children, and so from her went forth evil spirits and demons into the world. End quote. According to the Zohar, Naamah was transformed into a siren, the same described by Greek mythology, as were the other women who sinned with her. As the first, Naamah was cursed with the role of the mother of demons, whose duty is to carry out a multi-generational chain of tainted copulations, pregnancies, and births in order to produce the darkest of spirits. Quote, Naamah still exists, having her abode among the waves of the great sea. She goes forth and makes sport with men and conceives from them through their lustful dreams. From that lust she becomes pregnant. The sons whom she bears from human beings show themselves to the females of mankind, who become pregnant from them and bring forth spirits, and they all go to the ancient Lilith, who brings them up. End quote. Some of you may have heard of this being known as Lilith. Neither her nor Naamah are specifically mentioned in Enochian literature, but in Jewish folklore, Lilith is a very important figure. Actually, depending on the context, Lilith may be interpreted as either one individual being or an entire class of powerful female demons. In the Hebrew Bible, the word Lilith only appears once, specifically in the book of Isaiah. Quote, There shall the Lilith repose, and find for herself a place to rest. There the hoot owl shall nest and lay eggs, hatch them out and gather them in her shadow. End quote. There's a clear relation between a Lilith spirit and a siren, as both are evil beings associated with women and birds. The word Lilith itself is thought to be an ancient Hebrew term for a night bird. However, if we rewind back to the beginning of her story in Jewish tradition, you'll see that Lilith, the original one, was once a human woman. According to Jewish folklore, Lilith was actually the first wife of Adam in the Garden of Eden, not Eve. You might remember that the book of Genesis states that Eve was created from Adam's rib, basically as a derivative of God's original prototype. Lilith, on the other hand, was formed from the same clay as Adam and created at the same time. There was a problem though. Lilith wasn't a submissive woman. She was extremely independent. After refusing to serve Adam, Lilith left the Garden of Eden and would eventually couple with a certain archangel, Samael. She seduced Samael, became his wife, bred with him, and gave birth to demon children, notably a son named Asmodeus. Thus, Lilith and Samael are the demonological parallel to Adam and Eve. Many see the story as confirmation that Samael is the first fallen angel. And in this regard, Samael is the Jewish Talmudic equivalent of a far more well-known biblical figure, the devil Satan. But without getting ahead of ourselves, we're talking about folklore, not scripture. So there are truly many twists and turns in terms of the story of Lilith. Some accounts, such as the treatise on the left emanation, tell that God actually castrated Samael in order to stop him and Lilith from producing more demonic offspring. However, this led Lilith to seek intercourse with other men, human men, though she remained as Samael's partner. Turning back to the Zohar, there's a continuation of this tale, intertwining with the events that occurred after Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Their fall from Eden caused them to be separated from each other for 130 years, and during this time, Lilith actually went back and seduced Adam, and they had offspring together, 2 daughters, one of which was Naamah. As we know, Naamah would grow up to be the very first woman to seduce the Watchers, and from them, she birthed what the Zohar describes as demons. In the Judean desert, 1947, just 1 year before the outbreak of a terrible conflict that wages on to this day, an Arab shepherd was searching for his lost goat when he stumbled upon the mouth of a dark cave. Thinking his goat ran in, he threw a rock in to scare it, but what rang back was the sound of shattered pottery. He brought back some friends to see what was in there, and they discovered an array of slender ceramic vases, each filled with scrolls. They took the scrolls back to their camp and hung them up in their tent, trying to sell them. Multiple dealers told them that they were worthless forgeries and likely stolen. Finally, a friendly tribe leader referred them to a local shoemaker and part-time antique dealer, who ended up buying the scrolls for around 340 modern US dollars. The problem was that these scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, were simply unbelievable. Most people, including archaeologists and scholars, found it impossible that manuscripts as old as they appeared to be could have possibly survived the eventful history and hazardous environment of the Judean desert for over 2,200 years. The oldest copy of the Hebrew Bible known at that time dated to the late 9th century AD, and the copy found in the Dead Sea Scrolls was from as early as the 3rd century BC. To this day, the Dead Sea Scrolls remain one of the most important discoveries in all of history. Beyond revelations of how the Old Testament we know today was worded in ancient times, there was a far more unexpected surprise in store. The scrolls also contained certain apocalyptic scriptures that were once incredibly influential, but later rejected by religious authorities who labored to make them extinct from biblical canon. They were hidden in this cave so they might survive. These include 1st Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Book of Giants. As 1st Enoch is the key to certain mysteries of the biblical book of Genesis, the Books of Jubilees and Giants are the keys to the questions left by the Book of Enoch, particularly regarding the Nephilim, the gigantic cannibalistic offspring of the Watchers, as well as the flood God sent to wipe them from the earth. In Enochian literature, it's strongly implied that the Nephilim's violent acts were what justified the flood. In the Book of the Watchers, they're described as eating humans, animals, and even each other alive, and drinking blood, the worst possible sin. They may have been unnatural products of forbidden copulation. However, the question is, were the Nephilim actually evil, terrible monsters by their very nature? Or was their brutality a result of their circumstances? God only described the Nephilim spirits as evil after placing his curse on them, not before. Unfortunately, 1st Enoch gives no details of them or their actions as individuals, and this leaves a noticeable gap in their lore. The Book of Giants, as the title suggests, is far more elaborate in its descriptions of these beings as thinking, feeling, imperfect creatures, not so unlike us humans, only pushed by sizable circumstances out of their control. Just like humans, some Nephilim are in fact evil by nature, but others aren't. The Book of Giants tells of events in the Nephilim and Watcher community prior to the flood. It's honestly a surprisingly action-packed story, and while I'm excited to jump in, there's a peculiar problem with the text itself that you need to be aware of. All Enochian literature tends to have multiple versions of varying degrees of difference, and in the case of the Book of Giants, there are only 2 to choose from: an extremely fragmented Aramaic copy found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a still fragmented but far more complete Manichaean adaptation discovered in China. While both are very ancient, the Aramaic version is the oldest and most accurate to the original source, but it's nearly impossible to read. Simply put, the Manichaean version is more complete, and thankfully appears to be directly based on the Aramaic one, though certain details have been altered to fit the beliefs of Manichaeism, a once major religion founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century AD. Manichaeism is a truly fascinating religion, as it combined the traditions and beliefs of Judaism, Gnosticism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and even Buddhism, and even adopted many of their religious writings, one of which was the Book of Giants. But this wasn't just any old text. The Book of Giants was one of the original 6 scriptures of the Manichaean Church, and its adaptation was written by the prophet Mani himself. For our purposes, we'll mostly stick to the Aramaic version of the Book of Giants, and only rely on the Manichaean adaptation for a strikingly weird divergence in the very beginning, and another at the very end. So, the Book of Giants begins with Enochian literature's customary introduction, the retelling of the Watcher's lust for human women, the forbidden copulation, and the birth of their gigantic offspring. While both the Aramaic and Manichaean versions follow this, the big difference about the Manichaean adaptation is its premise. Because Gnosticism was a massive influence for the prophet Mani, in his reinterpretation, the Watchers aren't actually angels at all, but rather beings found in Gnostic lore, archons. These are basically archdemons who live in the cosmos. As the Manichaean scholar Walter Bruno Henning states, quote, "The heavenly origin of the fallen Watchers did not square with Mani's conviction that no evil could come from good. Therefore he transformed them into demons. Namely, those demons that, when the world was being constructed, had been imprisoned in the skies under the supervision of the Rex Honoris, the second son of the Manichaean god Mithra. They rebelled and were recaptured, but 200 of them escaped to the earth." End quote. So, having broken out of this prison-like structure in the nearby cosmos, the ones who got away chose Earth as their destination. In the Manichaean text, their reason was not only to hide there, but because their superpowered vision spied a vast number of young women whose beauty made them lust for them. Generally speaking, the Manichaean version continues with this darker, more ancient aliens-esque interpretation of events, where these cosmic invaders proceed to force their desires and subjugate and enslave the human race. While that's fascinating in and of itself, it's a rather short section in the Book of Giants, and the 2 versions mostly align when we reach the main narrative of the Nephilim. What occurs with the Nephilim is a rather surprising act of mercy from God. In 1st Enoch, the Lord gives no hints of his sympathy for these beings. He pits them in a never-ending civil war, intends to drown the few survivors with an inescapable flood, and places a terrible everlasting curse on their very souls. This does come off as a bit excessive, thus the Book of Giants answers this concern. The story tells that the merciful Lord actually sent prophetic warnings, as well as an opportunity for the Nephilim to repent. These warnings came in the form of dreams, first experienced by two Nephilim, one named Oya, the son of the chief watcher Samyaza, and the other named Mahwe. These dreams were so vivid and powerful that they felt compelled to share what they saw with the watchers and the other Nephilim. Mahwe's dream was of a stone tablet with many names written on it, and the tablet being submerged into water. When the tablet emerged, all names had been washed away except for 3. To the reader, it is clear this was a prophetic vision of the deluge, the great flood to come, the remaining names representing Noah and his family, the only ones who'd survive. However, no Nephilim or Watcher was able to guess it, though they did interpret it as a sign that heavenly judgment was coming, and efforts to stop it would be futile. Oya's dream was similar to Mahwe's. Oya saw a large tree being pulled from the ground and uprooted, but stopped from being torn away completely by only 3 roots. The Nephilim and Watchers reached a similar conclusion. A massive punishment was coming, only a few would survive, and it would be utterly unstoppable. Oya panicked and insisted that, quote, "It is not for us, but for Azazel, for he did it," end quote. More dreams would come in the following days, each more ominous than the last. The Watchers and the Nephilim became plagued with anxiety. Finally, someone suggested that they ask Enoch for help, and pleaded with Mahwe to approach him. Mahwe agreed and undertook a cosmic journey to visit the Patriarch, and requested Enoch's interpretation and guidance. Enoch accepted, and left to speak to God in heaven. When he returned, he gifted Mahwe 2 massive twin tablets from God himself. Their message was overwhelmingly grim. However, it hid a vague invitation that may have changed their fate. Quote, "Let it be known to you that the land is crying out and complaining about you and the deeds of your children, the harm that you have done to it, until the Archangel Raphael arrives. Behold, destruction is coming, a great flood, and it will destroy all living things, and whatever is in the deserts and the seas. But now loosen the bonds binding you to evil, and pray," end quote. This is where the Aramaic fragments end. It isn't the actual end, but the conclusion of the story is missing, and as of this date, a complete Aramaic copy of the Book of Giants has never been found. That said, the Manichaean version has its own ending, and it's surprisingly climactic. We have to rewind to the events before Mahwe was sent to visit Enoch, because in this version, Enoch actually visits their community himself, alongside a handful of heavenly helpers. Remember, unlike the Aramaic version whose Watchers were morally complex beings who engaged in a conspiracy many would later regret, the Manichaean adaptation reinterprets the Watchers as wicked cosmic demons who are pure evil through and through. So, Enoch descended with intentions to ease the worries of the Nephilim, beings not purely evil, unlike their fathers. However, their fathers, the 200 demonic archons, realized that they far outnumbered Enoch's heavenly guard, so they lunged at them and took these lesser angels hostage. This triggered an immediate emergency response from heaven. The clouds opened up and revealed 4 archangels rocketing down to stop them. Quote, "And when the 200 demons saw those angels, they were very much afraid and worried. They assumed the shape of men and hid themselves. Thereupon the angels forcibly removed the men from the demons, laid them aside, and put a guard over them." End quote. The archangels arrived and quickly gathered up the innocent Nephilim not involved in the hostage situation. The archangels picked these giants up from the ground and flew them to safety, scattering them across 32 distant towns in the mountains, homesteads that God, omniscient as he is, had prepared for them long ago. When the archangels returned soon after, a massive, fiery battle broke out between them and the Watchers. The turning point, however, was the use of some sort of heavenly weapon. Quote, "Those 200 demons fought a hard battle until the angels used fire, naphtha, and brimstone, the great fire of ruin that sets the worlds ablaze. On brilliant wings, they flew outside and above that fire and gazed into its depth and height at those souls that may try to escape from the fire." End quote. I'm probably not alone in thinking this massive, world-burning, war-ending great fire of ruin sounds suspiciously like a description of an ancient nuclear weapon. Regardless, this was the final blow, and heaven was victorious. The four archangels proceeded to bind the Watchers with everlasting chains and cast them into a pitch-black subterranean prison located deep under the mountains. Finally, they annihilated their children, the Nephilim complicit in the plot. It's a dark end to the story, but it does imply that a number of innocent Nephilim were saved. And we might guess that these were the Nephilim who chose to heed God's advice to pray and repent for their sins. But what about the flood to come? Thankfully, we're not at the bottom of the rabbit hole just yet. For this, we'll steer our investigation to the next Enochian text on our list, the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees stands with 1st Enoch as an ancient text that was once highly regarded and influential in the Jewish and early Christian communities. And like 1st Enoch, Jubilees was eventually rejected as canonical scripture, except in Ethiopia, where in ancient times it was translated to Ge'ez and maintained as genuine biblical scripture. And as perhaps the most obvious evidence of its worth, the original keepers of the Dead Sea Scrolls found the Book of Jubilees so vital that they stored no less than 15 complete copies of it. That's more copies than the ones they kept for a vast majority of the books of the Hebrew Bible. And it's far more than what they kept of both 1st Enoch and the Book of Giants, so it's clear which one they preferred. Generally speaking, Enochian texts such as these serve to provide answers to the mysteries never properly explained in the biblical book of Genesis. One of the biggest, arguably, is what exactly justified the flood, an indiscriminate world-wiping event. While Genesis simply blamed corruption and violence, 1st Enoch gave us the details, the Book of Giants took us into the action, and Jubilees summarizes what we've learned. Quote, "Owing to these three things came the flood upon the earth, the fornication wherein the Watchers went a-whoring after the daughters of men. They made the beginning of uncleanness, and they begat sons, the Nephilim, and they devoured one another. And after this they sinned against the beasts and birds, and all that moves and walks on the earth." End quote. Relevant to our investigation, Jubilees goes much further than any other Enochian text in two specific areas, the Great Flood and the demons it brought with it. The Book of Jubilees contains an unnervingly poetic description of the very moment the cataclysm came. Quote, "The Lord opened 7 floodgates of heaven, and the mouths of the fountains of the great deep, 7 mouths in number. And the floodgates began to pour down water from heaven 40 days and 40 nights, and the fountains of the deep also sent up waters, until the whole world was full of water. And the Lord destroyed everything from the face of the earth. He destroyed everything." End quote. As we know, the flood is closely intertwined with the release of the first demons. The Nephilim who drowned would die, and from them, their cursed spirits would be torn from their bodies. Instead of ascending to heaven, they were damned to walk the earth until the final day of judgment. As the Book of the Watchers described, quote, "The spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and they cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses." End quote. So the fuel of demons was, and still is, an unquenchable torment. almost a mirror of the one that drove them to brutal violence in their lifetime as Nephilim. It's a terrible fate. According to the Book of Jubilees, it was quite a while after the Great Flood had passed that the first true demons began to cause humans trouble. After Noah landed his ark, his 3 sons divided the earth and each claimed their own territory, and later they had sons of their own who further split the land. It was specifically at this point that the demons emerged to lead this new generation astray, toward corruption and death. After the first few casualties, Noah's sons informed him, and Noah made a desperate plea to God. Quote, "Let your free unmerited pardon be lift up upon my sons, and let not wicked spirits rule over them. Imprison the demons and hold them fast in the place of condemnation, and let them not bring destruction on the sons of your servant. For these are malignant and created in order to destroy." End quote. Surprisingly, God decided to grant Noah his wish in full. He ordered that all the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim be bound. That said, trouble was lurking. The spirits had a leader, a shadowy entity referred to by the title Mastema, which translates to Prince of Hostility. Before his dark legions could be cast away, Mastema quickly offered the Lord an alternative option. Quote, "Creator, let some of them remain before me, and let them listen to my voice, and do all that I shall say unto them. For if some of them are not left to me, I shall not be able to execute the power of my will on the sons of men, for corruption and leading them astray before your judgment. For great is the wickedness of the sons of men." And God said, "Let the 10th part of them remain before him, Mastema, and let 9 parts descend into the place of condemnation." End quote. Thus, while the overwhelming demonic population was greatly reduced, 10% would remain on Earth under the leadership of Mastema. And just 2 verses later, is confirmed who Mastema is, the devil known as Satan. Though God's flip-flopping may come off as strange, this was a win-win situation. Perhaps not for Noah, but for Satan and God. Demons are actually very important, simply because their purpose is to make our lives miserable. Let me explain. The following infamous segment from the Book of the Watchers makes it dead clear that it's God's intention to make humans the target of demons. Quote, "The spirits of the giants shall rise up against humankind, because they have proceeded from them. The spirits having gone forth shall destroy without incurring judgment. Thus they will make desolate until the day of the consummation of the great judgment." End quote. You might be asking, why would God want demons to torment us? Why does he encourage it in their very nature and enable them by removing any and all repercussions? These are good theological questions. Most find the answer in the biblical book of Job, where a remarkably disturbing tale is told of a bet made between God and Satan. God boasted to Satan of a God-fearing righteous man named Job, who, up to that point, had foiled all of Satan's temptations. Satan snapped back with a bold question, quote, "Does Job fear God for no reason? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand." End quote. Satan then proceeded to make Job's life absolutely miserable. He took his wealth, killed his livestock, killed his servants, and eventually even killed his children. He cursed Job's body with boils and pushed Job's friends to accuse him of sinning and tell him that he deserved his suffering. Job's every waking hour was nonstop suffering and despair for 2 entire years, during which Job repeatedly stated, "I loathe my life," in more or less those words. And as Satan predicted, Job slowly developed a bitter hatred for God. He even considered filing a legal court case against God. Seriously. In the end, though, Job still feared God. Actually, he became so terrified that God had to intervene and command Job to be brave and put a stop to the challenge. In order to make it up to him, God restored Job's health, gave him twice as much wealth, and helped his wife bear new children. Of all the cruel things in the Bible, this one definitely ranks high, but returning to our question, why God encourages and enables demons to make our lives harder, is a test of faith, and this test ends on Judgment Day. So while the fate of the Nephilim was to die and become demons, there's actually still more to the story of these cursed giants. Even though the flood was thought to have wiped out every living thing on Earth, with exception to those on Noah's Ark, certain verses in the Hebrew Bible open up a big conflicting mystery here. As seems to be the trend, this mystery begins with the book of Genesis. Quote, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." End quote. Most scholars interpret this as a reference to post-flood Nephilim, survivors. And beyond Genesis, there is more canonical evidence of them. Earlier, I mentioned that in the Book of Numbers, several Israelite spies reported an entire population of Nephilim who occupied the land of Canaan. They not only explicitly called them Nephilim, but the spies described themselves feeling like tiny grasshoppers in comparison to them. According to most calculations, this was around 400 to 500 years after the Great Flood. These Nephilim hadn't just survived the flood, though, they thrived. The spies reported them living in large fortified cities and nourishing themselves with advanced agriculture. Specifically, their fruits were so gigantic that it would take 2 regular-sized adult men to transport even a single cluster of their grapes. The Nephilim of Canaan aren't the only post-flood giants mentioned in the Bible, but they are the only ones specifically referred to as Nephilim, and that's good enough to start speculating. The giant question is, how did the Nephilim survive the flood? In Jewish folktales, it's a popular mystery. Some claim that a few Nephilim clung to the sides of Noah's Ark, and others speculate that the wife of Ham, Noah's son, was a Nephilim, and she survived on the Ark with them. However, it's likely more that was an insult to Ham's wife, especially as Ham himself doesn't have a very good reputation in the Bible. Moving on to Islamic legend, a race of giants known as the Ad survived the flood simply because, standing at a height of around 100 feet, they were too tall to drown. Seeing as how the Nephilim in 1st Enoch were 450 feet tall, maybe it's possible. The book of Genesis specifies that, quote, 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered, end quote. That's around 22 feet above the highest mountain peaks. But consider that in the Book of Giants, the innocent Nephilim were relocated to 32 distant towns in the mountains, a rather convenient location. It was also described as one God specifically prepared for the Nephilim, and maybe that was to save them. Finally, another possibility is that the Watchers or some other angels continued to reproduce with human women after the flood. While the original 200 Watchers may have been imprisoned for eternity, some have speculated that a new group of Watchers fell to the same old temptation, a repeat of events that led to a new generation of Nephilim being born. No matter the truth, though, their fate would forever be the same. The Nephilim were cursed, and as mortals, even those who survived the flood were bound to die, as would their children and their children's children. A production line of demons, essentially. Perhaps the ancient humans realized this and drove the Nephilim to extinction in order to end the cycle. That might explain why there's no evidence of giants still living on Earth, although some conspiracy theorists might argue otherwise. 10% of the dead Nephilim remain, though, according to Enochian lore, disembodied evil spirits under the control of Mastema, otherwise known as Satan. This entity, Satan, is one of the most mysterious figures in scripture, folklore, and apocrypha. Primarily, this revolves around what Satan actually is. The final chapter of our demonological investigation will attempt to answer one question. Is Satan one and the same as Lucifer, the first fallen angel? I dug through some pretty dusty archives for the most obscure details I could find on this, and I can say, for such a well-known story, there's a lot of secrets you've never been told. In the biblical book of Isaiah, chapter 14, verse 12, a Hebrew word is found that translates either to son of the morning or the morning star, a reference to the planet Venus. Later Latin translations replace this descriptor with a name, Lucifer, which means light bringer. Just as in the morning, the planet Venus appears to shine far brighter than all other celestial bodies, minus the sun, the Bible defines the angel Lucifer as one of the highest of all angels, and one of the closest to God. The prophet Ezekiel described this angel as, quote, the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Every precious stone was his covering. He was the anointed cherub, end quote. Strength, brilliance, beauty, position. All these gifts given to him by God would ultimately make him forget that one truth. Lucifer's own greatness stirred a fire inside of him, of pride and eventually jealousy of the one being that outshined him. He said in his heart, quote, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, end quote. This desire was what led him to fall from heaven. God's own hand pushed Lucifer off, and in the words of Jesus Christ, he fell like lightning. Lucifer was cast down to the earth. In Christian belief, this was the event that transformed the angel Lucifer into the devil Satan, and why most believe that Satan is, in fact, a fallen angel. Now, herein lies the puzzle. The problem is that no biblical verse explicitly states that Lucifer is Satan. Worse yet, verses such as that found in 2 Corinthians make things extra confusing. Quote, Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light, end quote. This verse makes it seem like Satan might not be an angel, but simply disguises himself as one to trick his victims. That said, there's a reason why most Christian traditions see them as the same being. There's a wealth of hints and evidence throughout the Bible. For example, the book of Job describes Satan appearing in heaven with the other sons of God, a biblical term used for angels. In passages of the Gospel of Matthew and the book of Revelation, Satan is described as the leader of fallen angels, an entire population of them. Revelation is also the scripture that Christians use to directly connect Lucifer to Satan, due to its words being poetic but strong parallels to the Old Testament's accounts of Lucifer's fall. Quote, War broke out in heaven. The archangel Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him, end quote. While the vast majority of Christian traditions agree that this links Satan to Lucifer, the question most people ask, though, is when exactly this event described in Revelation took place. Was it in the past, Satan's first and only fall from heaven? Or will it happen in the future, Satan's second and final fall? Thankfully, the answer is simple. Both Christian tradition and the vast majority of biblical scholars treat the book of Revelation as a prophecy of the future, and the context of this verse makes it clear that this event occurs during the final days. So Satan actually fell twice from heaven, or at least he will have come the day of judgment. That said, while Revelation is by and large a vision of events to come, it does contain brief glimpses into the past. Most relevantly, a reference to Satan's fall in the past, his first, and it even adds another important detail to the lore. Quote, There another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth." End quote. This verse may be metaphorical, but most agree on its meaning, that when Lucifer was cast out of heaven, he took 1/3 of all angels with him, or more accurately, they followed him as their leader. This was the first mass fall of angels, before that of the 200 Watchers. This verse in Revelation, combined with the 2 accounts of Lucifer's fall found in the books of Ezekiel and Isaiah, are all the Bible tells us about this event. As we know, apocryphal scriptures tend to exist in order to fill in gaps left by the Bible. However, the books of Enoch, Giants, and Jubilees never mention Lucifer's fall. And this extends to the vast majority of Apocrypha, surprisingly. Very few ever touched on this narrative. But for those who did, there's actually 2 completely different versions of the story. As for which one, if any, is the true account, that choice is up to you. We'll begin with the one probably very familiar to any of my Muslim viewers, because this origin story is the one told in the Quran. But perhaps my Jewish viewers will recognize it too, since it actually comes from Jewish tradition. The oldest Jewish apocryphon containing this story is known as the Life of Adam and Eve, which scholars widely agree dates back to the 1st century AD. That said, I want to switch things up a bit and give the Islamic version our focus here, especially as it goes quite a bit more in depth. But don't worry, I will point out exactly where the parallel is. So, to set the context, in Islam, the devil's name is Iblis. Iblis is to Muslims what Satan is to Christians. He's the adversary of Allah, the name for God in Arabic, and he's the ruler of hell, commander of his demonic legions, and the visionary of their dark mission to tempt mankind toward the path of sin. In Islam, there are 2 interpretations of what the nature of Iblis is, based on details in the Quran, ancient traditional beliefs, and statements given by the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. One interpretation argues that Iblis was originally a jinn, a powerful spiritual entity usually thought of as demonic, but to be more accurate, jinn are morally ambiguous beings with free will, much like us humans. We'll be focusing on the other interpretation though, that Iblis was once the highest ranking archangel, the closest to the throne of Allah. According to Islamic legend, when Allah was forming the first man, Adam, from clay, he left him to dry for 40 days. And during this period, all the angels came to see Allah's new creation, and Iblis was among them. He looked at the clay body, frowned, and kicked it so hard with his foot that it reverberated with sound. Whether this myth is truth or lore is up to you, but the story in the Quran picks up from here. And the following events are nearly an exact parallel to the Jewish version in the Life of Adam and Eve. At this point, the creation of man was complete, and Allah breathed life into Adam. Then he turned toward his angels and ordered all of them to bow before Adam. So in Islamic tradition, humans are the most supreme creation, with the only being humans should bow to being Allah. Both jinn and angels are below mankind, so this is the reason why Allah ordered his angels to bow to Adam, in order to submit to his superiority and authority. The Jewish interpretation is a bit different though. In Jewish belief, mankind was made in God's own image. Thus, God asked his angels to bow to Adam in worship of the image of God. That difference aside, the outcome is the same in both the Islamic and Jewish versions. As ordered, all of the angels bow to Adam, all except for one. As written in the Quran, Iblis flat out refused. Quote, "I am better than he. Thou hast created me out of fire, whereas him thou hast created out of clay." And Allah said, "Down with thee then from this state. Among the humiliated shalt thou be." End quote. Allah promised Iblis eternal hell for his defiance, but this fallen angel was not ready to go. Iblis responded, quote, Grant me a respite till the day when all shall be raised from the dead. End quote. In saying this, Iblis challenged Allah directly, similar to how Satan challenged God in the book of Job. If Allah gave Iblis ample time before his doom in hell, how many descendants of Adam could he lead astray? Allah accepted and placed his wager. Iblis was given till the day of judgment to tempt all but the most true and devout believers toward the path of sin. But despite Iblis's wish granted, his response immediately after was rather bizarre. Iblis bitterly blamed the Almighty for his own fall. Quote, "Thou hast thwarted me. I shall most certainly lie in ambush for them all, and most of them thou wilt find ungrateful." End quote. This response has confused many over the centuries, specifically that first part, "Thou hast thwarted me," as if Iblis was in complete ignorance of the sin he just committed that led to Allah casting him out as an angel. This is why many Muslims believe that it was during this very moment that evil took over his entire being. Allah transformed the first angel into Iblis, the devil, an evil entity driven by the hurt of a seemingly unjust betrayal and absolute confidence in his singular goal, to win the bet. But here's the kicker. The majority of Islamic scholars purport that angels have no free will. None. Very different from Christian belief. So, if that's true, Allah was the reason why Iblis refused to bow to Adam. As a pawn in Allah's plan, each move laid out perfectly from beginning to the end of time, it was Allah who caused Iblis's fall. Alright, that's the first narrative. Iblis, or Satan, refused to bow to Adam. But as I mentioned, there's an alternative version, one whose legacy wasn't made through religious scripture or apocrypha, but instead its lasting significance in popular culture. You've probably heard of Paradise Lost, the 17th century epic poem written by John Milton. Paradise Lost is a genuine classic and deserving of its reputation as a masterpiece of literature. However, it's not the first text to tell this story. In fact, Paradise Lost borrows heavily from a far older and incomparably more obscure text, the Old English epic today referred to as Genesis B. As the name implies, there's also a Genesis A, because the manuscript these two works were rediscovered in combined them as one. However, later on, fragments of older copies were found and proved that the two were originally separate. The oldest known copy of Genesis B was written in the early 9th century AD. Before then, it had been passed down in oral tradition for hundreds of years and possibly dating back to the early days of Christianity. And this implies that Genesis B may have not been intended purely for storytelling, but as a medium of religious truth. The respected world authority on Genesis A and B, Dr. Algernon Doane, remarked, quote, "It seems safe to say that this is theologically, if not dramatically, the most sophisticated and complete realization of this topic." End quote. That topic is the fall of Lucifer and his transformation into Satan. The infamous fallen angel is the main character, and the story is told from his eyes. So, if it's good enough for the expert Dr. Doane, we might take a leap of faith and treat Genesis B the same as we did Enochian literature, controversial to biblical canon but accurate to the lore. And while it begins with familiar details, trust me, after the fall it gets a bit more complicated. Quote, "The Holy Lord, through his hand power, created 10 kindred of angels. In them he trusted well, but one among them he had made so strong. God allowed him to wield such power, highest after himself in the heavens. But this one turned himself away. His angel began to become overly proud. 'Why must I toil?' he asked. 'There is no need at all for me to have a master. I can mold many wondrous things with my own hands. I can be a god just like him. Strong warriors stand beside me. They have chosen me as their Lord." End quote. Eventually, God heard word of Lucifer's prideful boasts and his conspiracy to carry out a large-scale coup in heaven. Thus, God swelled with anger and enacted his punishment. Quote, "The Lord cast him into hell, into the deep chasm where he changed into a devil, the enemy with all his allies. They fell down from heaven a very long time, 3 nights and days. Those angels from heaven into hell. The Lord wrought him a name ever since. The most lofty, said God, must thenceforth be called Satan." End quote. Now in hell, the fallen angels were in absolute agony. Satan bitterly vented to his followers, quote, "This narrow place is much unlike the other home that we knew. He had no right to render this. Most sorrow to me is God's creation of mankind. That Adam, who was shaped from the earth, shall possess my fortified throne and dwell there in joy, while we must suffer this torment and injury in hell. I am without power. A tormenting chain of rings has prevented me from moving." End quote. Satan went on to describe the huge iron fetters and bolts binding his hands, feet, and even neck, and that even if he could move, his personal prison cell in hell was barred shut. Satan would never be able to escape, but he did see a clear opportunity to get revenge. As God took away the light from Satan and his angels, Satan would take away the light God gave to mankind in their creation. He declared, quote, "Consider it, all of you. Consider how you might deceive them. I could rest me more easily in these chains afterwards, if the light were lost to them. He that fulfills this task, for him will be a ready reward forever after. I shall let him sit with me myself." End quote. This is the point where the Genesis B text begins to conflict with traditional Christian beliefs, because Satan is permanently bound to his prison. Thus, the serpent in the Garden of Eden wasn't Satan himself, but a different fallen angel. Unfortunately, immediately after this monologue, 2 entire sections are missing from the Genesis B manuscript, as if someone tore them out. So we don't know who exactly this fallen angel was. The narrative picks back up as this dark being flies out of hell to carry out Satan's plan. He successfully fools Adam and Eve into eating the forbidden fruit and praises his master, Satan, yearning to return to hell to be at Satan's side and claim his prize. Whoever this fallen angel was, he'd become the surrogate of Satan, the proxy through which the devil, bound by his chains and cell walls, could freely perform his acts of evil on earth. This particular detail is one of the biggest reasons why there is a surprising amount of controversy surrounding Genesis B. It's a major twist of interpretation, suggesting that Satan's appearances in the Bible might not actually be him, but this unknown fallen angel. But a surrogate of the devil may not be as strange as it seems. In the Old Testament, it's rather apparent that God has his own surrogate. I actually investigated this in depth in my video on angelology, the being referred to as the angel of the Lord. However, there is at least one referred to as the angel of the Lord. However, there is at least one confirmed appearance of the true devil in the Bible. The book of Revelation foretells of future events where Satan is bound by a great chain and locked in the abyss for 1,000 years, then let back out again to cause destruction, then locked away once again, this time in the lake of fire. Just as the evil spirits of the dead Nephilim serve a purpose for God, so does Satan. Hence why God loosens his chains on occasion, only to tie him back up due to the enormous destruction he causes. That and his tendency to wage war on heaven. So, returning to Genesis B, after Satan's surrogate planted the seeds of sin in mankind, The narrative carries on to other events written of in the book of Genesis. It details every generation, even describing the life of the patriarch Enoch himself, as well as his living ascent to heaven. Further generations pass, and finally we arrive at the events described in the Book of the Watchers. Quote, "The people multiplied throughout Middle-earth sons and daughters, up to now precious to the Lord and glory blessed, until the sons of God began to seek out wives among the kindred. The Lord wished to set his punishment on the angels, strike the sinful of deeds into death, the kindred of giants, unbeloved by God. The Lord would kill them all in days to come." End quote. As obscure as Genesis B is, in the world of fallen angel demonology, it's an important text. The narrative includes both the fall of Lucifer and the fall of the Watchers in a defined timeline. It mentions the giants, the Nephilim, and ties their sins to the flood. It integrates Enochian lore, but its focus is elsewhere, and it's provocative, just like the rest. We might say that Genesis B, along with 1st Enoch, the Book of Giants, Jubilees, and the life of Adam and Eve are all fallen angels of religious texts because they walk a very different path. They challenge the dogma we've been told was right and true. They spread knowledge deemed forbidden, and for that, they faced punishment. Only these few survived, despite the efforts taken by religious authorities to expunge them all from the earth. Unfortunately, others just like them were made extinct. What and how much was lost, only God knows. But thank God these survived, because without them, I wouldn't be able to offer you congratulations, because by watching this video in its entirety, I hereby grant you the title of Amateur Fallen Angel Demonologist. And if that wasn't a thing before, it sure as hell is now. You brave some of the most obscure tales and traditions in Abrahamic religion, so let's keep them alive and keep digging for more. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this investigation on fallen angel lore, I encourage you to complete the biblical trinity with my obsessively deep dives into angelology and demonology. Or if you're looking for something in the same vein, but a bit more spicy and occult, check out my video Treasure Hunting with Demons. Thank you to my patrons. Your support not only funds these videos, but it motivates me to take on truly challenging rabbit holes like this. If you'd like to join in, I've got links in the description to pledge monthly or make a one-time donation. 100% goes back into these videos, and that's my promise to you. I'm Mr. Mythos. Never stop seeking. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
How are these interacting with our fighters, if they are? How are they interacting with the weather and their environment? How are they interacting with each other? So can we look at these and how they're interacting perhaps as a swarm, especially off the East Coast where there's
This investigation is sponsored by Established Title. This investigation is sponsored by This investigation is sponsored by Magic Spoon. This book, the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage, is one of my favorite grimoires, and that's for 3 good reasons. The first is that it's literally a step-by-step guide on how to summon your guardian angel, but that's only half the ritual. Your guardian angel is then supposed to instruct you on how to summon the 12 most powerful demons in hell and harness their powers for good. The second reason I love this book is that doing this whole thing successfully requires the most ludicrously complex and time-consuming ritual I've ever heard of. It's genuinely hardcore, and that's not an exaggeration. And the third reason is that this grimoire itself has a pretty mysterious lore, and I'm not just talking about the story that's written in it, which is actually pretty good for a grimoire, but I'm more talking about the rumors surrounding the people who actually attempted the ritual, and particularly the controversial occultist Aleister Crowley, who failed to complete it, and apparently left a portal to hell wide open, which unleashed chaos upon the world until he eventually closed it, or so the legends tell. But what is this grimoire really? Well, it's the tale of a young seeker of truth who traveled to Egypt and came across a mysterious hermit known as Abrumlin the Mage, who taught him a powerful system of magic. And whether or not you believe in the divine or the supernatural, you're guaranteed to find this stuff interesting. Hey fellow seekers, welcome. I'm Mr. Mythos. If you're a fan of strange and ancient mysteries with research so deep, you're guaranteed to fall down the rabbit hole, you're in the right place. I humbly ask that you give this video a like and ding the notification bell so you don't miss any of the rare info we'll be digging into every video. And if you love it, don't forget to share it with a friend. But before we dive into this treasure trove of magic, let me tell you about something else that's known for its magical properties to bring you back in time. I recently discovered Magic Spoon cereal, and I swear it transports me back to my childhood. Growing up, I had a serious sweet tooth and I ate cereal all the time, but as I've gotten older, I've been trying to cut back on carbs and sugar and focus on healthier eating. That's why Magic Spoon is genuinely magical for me. Angelic magic. The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage dates back to the Renaissance period, possibly as old as the 15th century. However, the magical ideas written in it likely derive from hundreds of years earlier, in the late antique period, when many esoteric schools of thought, both Eastern and Western, intermingled and began to spread into Europe. This includes the beliefs and practices of Kabbalah, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and Neoplatonism. For authors of these type of mystical manuscripts, writing itself was a practice that carried occult or hidden power, and was mostly only done by priest-magicians. Therefore, this book of magic can also be considered as a magical book, imbued with mystical properties. And broadly speaking, that's the definition of a grimoire. So, to unlock its power, you have to read between the lines. As the old saying goes, every word speaks three. So depending on the translation, the Book of the Sacred Magic is actually made up of 3 to 4 separate books, and the first book is essentially the story of the hero's journey. While the narrative is definitely interesting on its own, don't be fooled by its simplicity. As commanded by the author, a man who calls himself Abraham of Worms, quote, "Thou shalt not neglect the study of this first book," end quote. Book 1 is Abraham's account of the journey he made and the magicians he met in his quest for divine wisdom, which took him from his home in Germany all the way to Egypt, where he eventually found a true master to mentor him, the mysterious hermit by the name of Abrumlin. And by passing his trials, Abraham came to possess Abrumlin's secrets of a practical, very real magic that allowed him to summon his guardian angel. Now, it's common for grimoires to use fictional stories as a framing device to interest the reader, as well as to give context to the occult secrets they contain. But in the case of the Book of the Sacred Magic, this journey undertaken by Abraham might have actually happened. There are certain historical connections we'll make a bit later, but with that in mind, let's jump right in. Our main protagonist, the claimed author of the grimoire, is Abraham, a Jew from the city of Worms in Germany who's believed to have lived somewhere in the 14th and 15th centuries AD. The text dates itself to the year 1458, written by Abraham as an old man. As Abraham had already taught his eldest son the Jewish system of mysticism known as Kabbalah, this entire grimoire and the sacred magic it contains were intended as a gift to his youngest son, Lamech, once Lamech came of age. Contained within, however, was a far more powerful form of Kabbalah than the one he had passed to his eldest son. It's not stated why Abraham made this choice, but certainly it was a calculated one. What sparked Abraham's pursuit of divine truth was ultimately the dying words of his own father. Quote, "My father Simon, shortly before his death, gave me certain signs and instructions concerning the way in which it is necessary to acquire the Holy Kabbalah. After his death, finding myself 20 years of age, I had a very great passion to understand the true mysteries of the Lord." End quote. Having committed to pursue the divine secrets, Abraham soon learned of a well-educated, respected, and very old rabbi named Moses, who was rumored to possess this wisdom. Traveling to the German city of Mainz, he committed himself to Moses' mentorship and teachings for 4 long years. However, while Moses acted with good intentions and was able to demonstrate some magical abilities, his practice of Kabbalah was unfortunately corrupted by pagan and occult ideas. Quote, "In his magic, he did not in any way make use of the wisdom of the Lord, but instead availed himself of certain arts and superstitions of infidel and idolatrous nations, in part derived from the Egyptians, together with images of the Medes and of the Persians, with herbs of the Arabians, together with the power of the stars and the constellations. And finally, he had drawn from every people and nation, and even from the Christians, some diabolical art. And in everything, the spirits blinded him to such an extent, even while obeying him in some ridiculous and inconsequent matter, that he actually believed that his blindness and error were the veritable magic, and therefore pushed no further his research into the true and sacred magic. I remained with him for 4 years, miserably wasting all that time there." End quote. Greatly disappointed at this realization, Abraham decided to leave his former master, but thankfully he didn't find himself completely alone. There was a young man from Bohemia named Samuel who had also studied in Moses' sect, and Samuel's pursuit of divine truth was just as genuine and passionate as Abraham's. Samuel had been planning a journey to Constantinople to join his uncle in a pilgrimage to his ancestors' Holy Land. This, Abraham felt, was the direction forward, so he decided to accompany him. On the 13th of February in 1397, the two commenced this immense trek, traveling through Germany, Bohemia, and Austria, then to Hungary and Greece, and finally to the city of Constantinople. Together they stayed in Constantinople for 2 years, and these years were apparently fruitful and important ones in Abraham's life, as he writes that he would have never left, if not for a tragic event. Unfortunately, Samuel was struck by a sudden and violent illness and died. With his heart overwhelmed, Abraham felt lost and could no longer stay in this city. So he left, once again, seeking the path of truth through the Middle East. Finally, nearly 10 years since the death of his father, Abraham's feet sunk into the sands of Egypt, where he would spend another year wandering, completely ignorant of the magical master he would soon encounter. Quote, "I arrived at a little town called Iraqi, situated on the bank of the Nile, where I lodged with an old Jew named Aaron, where indeed I had already lodged before in my journey. He asked me whether I had found that which I wished. I answered mournfully that I had done absolutely nothing, and I made him an exact recital of the labors and troubles which I had undergone, and my recital was accompanied by my tears, which I could not help shedding in abundance, so that I attracted the compassion of the old man, and he began to try to comfort me by telling me that during my journey he had heard say that in a desert place not far from the aforesaid town of Iraqi dwelt a very learned and pious man whose name was Brumlin. Aaron found me a guide who conducted me to the nearest route, by which, walking upon fine sand during the space of 3 days and a half without seeing any human habitation, I at length arrived at the foot of a hill of no great height, and which was entirely surrounded by trees. My guide then said, 'In this small wood dwelleth the man whom you seek.'" End quote. In this grimoire, we never actually find out much about a Brumlin, with the exception of a few scant details. Living 3.5 days from the nearest town of Iraqi, on a small hill and in a house hidden by trees, it's obvious that a Brumlin was a hermit shunning society, which was a challenging and intensely lonely lifestyle that certain Jews and Christians took on in the past in hopes of removing the distractions and temptations of society, so that they might entirely focus themselves on their relationship with God. It's unknown how long Abramelin had been out there, living in the middle of nowhere, but when Abraham first saw him appearing out from the thick of the trees, he described him as a venerable aged man. Abramelin wasn't shocked by Abraham's arrival though, as he was quick to salute and greet him, speaking in Chaldean, the biblical Aramaic language. Abraham must have also been fluent, as the language is no barrier between them, and to his extreme pleasure, the old sage immediately invited him into his humble home, as if he already knew what Abraham had come for. Behavior-wise, Abramelin was as pure and devout as you'd expect. Quote, "The good old man was very courteous to me and treated me very kindly, and during an infinitude of days he never spoke to me of any other matter than of the fear of God, exhorting me to lead ever a well-regulated life, and from time to time warned me of certain errors which man commits through human frailty, and further, he made me understand that he detested the acquisition of riches and goods through harm wrought to our neighbor. He required from me a very solemn and precise promise to change my manner of life and to not live according to our false dogmas, but in the way and law of the Lord." End quote. Abraham solemnly swore this promise to Abramelin, and thus began the master mentorship that would forever change the young seeker's life. Abramelin retreated into his small dusty library and returned with 2 weathered handwritten manuscripts, instructing his student to copy them by hand. Abraham points out to the reader that the content of these 2 manuscripts make up the second and third books of the grimoire, the Guardian Angel Summoning Ritual and the Magic Word Squares, both of which we'll be exploring in great detail later. However, though the manuscripts were in Abraham's hands, they weren't free of charge. Quote, "He asked me if I had any money. I answered unto him, Yes. He said unto me that he required 10 golden florins, which he must himself, according to the order which the Lord had given unto him, distribute by way of alms among 72 poor persons, who were obliged to repeat certain psalms." End quote. So there's a bit to discuss here. First off, the florin was one of the most widely used commercial currencies of the late Middle Ages, used all throughout Europe and beyond, including Egypt. It was a coin made of gold, worth anywhere between 140 to 1,000 modern US dollars. Thankfully, Abraham did have that kind of money on him so that he could receive the sacred knowledge he'd already spent a decade searching for. And speaking of a decade, 10 years, Abramelin asked for 10 gold coins to distribute among 72 poor persons. In grimoires, the use of numbers is incredibly important to look out for, as numerology is often used to obscure layered meanings to the text. So, beginning with the number 10, in Kabbalah, the Jewish esoteric teachings, 10 is a number of the Sephirot. The Sephirot are the 10 attributes through which God manifests itself and continuously creates the physical and metaphysical realms. These attributes include, for example, wisdom, loving kindness, might, and beauty, as well as other reflections of God's divine emotions, intellect, and nature. The ancient Kabbalists didn't mean for this to imply that God itself could be understood, but simply that these 10 attributes were the distinct ways in which God interacted with its creation. These attributes also interact with one another, as depicted in the famous Tree of Life diagram, where there are clearly illustrated links between them. The Kabbalists use these links to better understand God's way of creation. As for the 72